Chapter 201, A Contest of Hidden Cards. The diary hadn't raised any warnings. Ralph was most likely done for. Saul turned his head to look at the dazed Knight Olaf, who floated beside him in stunned silence. The resentment on his face had vanished. He stared ahead, dumbfounded like a child. He even looked a little sad. Narrowing his eyes, Saul activated his mental energy and examined Olaf's soul closely. To his surprise, a second face had appeared on Olaf's own, a face that belonged to the butler, Hunter, like a mask strapped to the knight's head. All of Olaf's pain and hatred stemmed from that face. "Your form is rather special, stronger even than many apprentice wizards I've met. Are you really just a powerless butler?" Saul asked curiously. Hunter's face first showed surprise, then turned venomous as his gaze locked onto Saul. "I underestimated you. You looked like nothing more than a wandering second-rank apprentice, but you've got a lot of nice toys." His expression carried a trace of sorrow. "I really am just a regular butler, but my intelligence far surpasses you man-eating wizards. If not for my poor magical aptitude, no wizard in the entire Bloodthorn family could compare to me. That pack of idiots wasted so many resources and couldn't even comprehend the simplest rune constructs. If only I had magic." Lost in his self-pity, Hunter calmed down slightly, his vacant eyes fixed on Saul. "You win, kid. You're a lucky one. I couldn't protect the honor of the Bloodthorns. Now it's fallen into the hands of a lowborn like you, but you're smarter than I expected. Maybe the Bloodthorn legacy will truly thrive in your care." He let out a bitter laugh. "Now go ahead, kill me." Saul stared at him in silence. At last, he realized that Hunter shared the same kind of talent he did. Excellent mental aptitude but terribly poor magic potential. Worse even than Saul's. The man didn't even have the qualifications to step into the wizarding world. With magic aptitude lacking, one had to find ways to enhance it artificially in order to keep learning and advancing. Wizard knowledge wasn't simple knowledge. It carried its own radiation and contamination. Had Saul not survived the transformation of his body, boosting his magic power, he would have been stuck as a first-rank apprentice forever, unable to learn deeper knowledge. And from what he later discovered, staying too long at any apprentice level would eventually lead to death by unknown contamination. In other words, a first-rank or second-rank apprentice over 30 could die at any moment, either consumed by madness or turned into a monster. The butler, Hunter, probably knew this. That's why he ultimately stayed outside the wizarding world, only daring to gaze longingly at its dangers and wonders from afar. Ironically, only after death, or rather after being turned into a wizard's tool, did his impressive mental talent finally find a use. He'd helped his master escape Victor's schemes and nearly tricked Saul, too. Saul couldn't help but feel a trace of admiration for him. He raised his hand. Transparent worms appeared on his arm and one shot out, landing on Hunter's face. Facing death, Hunter showed a flash of fear, but a small smile also curled at the corner of his lips. "It's finally over. I can go be with my master." But the transparent worm didn't immediately dissolve his soul. "Not quite," Saul said with a sudden smirk. He took out the blood-red magic crystal and lightly tossed it up and down. The Wraith of the Night, still bound to the crystal, bobbed up and down in the air with it. "Let's talk about the magic crystal. Any other traps inside? Did you tamper with those scrolls?" Hunter's closed eyes snapped open. He stared at Saul with utter shock and a hint of horror. You. How did I know you tampered with them? Maybe I watched too much TV in the past," Saul said with a teasing grin. Hunter didn't understand the reference, but he knew now. His final trap had been exposed. He deflated completely, his soul flickering like it could collapse at any moment. "Not going to talk? Well, you do seem the stubborn sort, ready to die rather than give up secrets. But that's fine. I've got ways to interrogate souls. It'll help pass the time while Ralph finishes dying." Hunter's soul trembled uncontrollably, as if he'd just seen the most terrifying demon in existence. 5 minutes later, the basement finally fell silent. Hunter's soul dissolved completely, full of unresolved resentment. Without Hunter's mental energy to support him, Olaf's wraith vanished almost instantly. Before disappearing, the knight gave Saul a glance filled with gratitude. Poor guy. Ever since stepping into Ralph's manor, he'd been used by everyone, both in life and after death. This is why regular people should never get involved in wizard affairs. Even death doesn't spare you from torment. Saul had originally planned to mention Seed, just to spite Hunter before the end. But he held his tongue. The manor was still dangerous. Victor's status remained uncertain. Best to keep some secrets buried. Thanks to his years of experience in the mortuary, Saul had skillfully uncovered Hunter's final trap. Turned out, the last third of each scroll within the magic crystal had deliberately been scrambled. One had to read them in a specific order, otherwise, the information would seem plausible but ultimately be false. If Saul had followed the false knowledge, it would have been like going mad from a cultivation error, ending in death or insanity. Looks like the information's safe now. Hunter had nothing left but instinct by the end, no rational thought. What he said was most likely true, and I still have the diary to verify it. Satisfied, Saul tucked the blood-red crystal back into his coat. The legacy of a wizarding family, what a haul, though I did have to burn that second-tier scroll in the end. He wiped the sweat from his chin with his sleeve. Both the battle in the basement and the interrogation afterward had drained his mental energy. Fortunately, Saul had a strong mental talent. Any ordinary second-rank apprentice would have fainted long ago. Of course, the victory wasn't just his own doing. He'd used plenty of external aids, too. Before the mission, the Tower Master had warned him this wouldn't be a simple trip. His life might be at stake. So, after careful consideration, Saul had splurged on a powerful trump card. He had just become a second-rank apprentice and lacked a reliable killing move. Thus, he bought a second-tier spell scroll, Flame Pearl. It was that scroll which had gravely wounded Ralph, allowing Saul's antidote to work quickly. Otherwise, the basement's barrier, damaged by Morden's brute force entry and barely stable for an hour, might have collapsed before the Worm Man died. So yes, sometimes it's better to invest in a single strong item than to collect a bunch of smaller ones. Besides, most items weren't as useful as little algae anyway. Saul crouched by the door and placed his hand on the basement's spell seal, but didn't activate it yet. Instead, he ran through a simulation in his mind. The diary told him the worm was barely alive but still lying in wait with its mouth open, hopping to swallow him whole. Saul frowned. The barrier didn't have much time left. If Ralph didn't die soon, Saul would have to retreat and come back later once it was safe. But he hesitated, glanced at the diary again, and crouched down once more. He silently counted to 20, then placed his hand on the door again. This time the diary said the worm was on its last legs. If Saul went down now, he could die along with it. He waited several more seconds and tried a third time. Now the diary said nothing about dying. It closed itself with a bored flutter and flew back to Saul's left shoulder. Ralph was finally finished. He no longer had the strength to drag anyone to hell with him. Saul smiled and carefully channeled his magic to unseal the basement door. Chapter 202, half a page. For the second time, Saul used the method Morden had taught him to forcefully open the basement door. The magic formation layered on the door immediately gave off a ripple of magic. The ripple surged from weak to strong, then faded again, until finally the formation lost all effect. The formation that had protected the Ralph estate for decades now passed into history, along with its original master. Saul reached out and with a slight effort pried the door fully open. A swirl of yellow and white smoke burst out from within. Saul waved a hand to clear it. He had planned to wait until the smoke dispersed before entering, but then noticed cracks forming on the basement walls. Without the protective magic, this long-abused basement was finally reaching its end. The smoke itself wasn't particularly toxic, just reeking of oil and grease, enough to kill anyone's appetite for days. Saul jumped down the entrance and landed with a splat in some sticky substance. The staircase formed of young girls' arms had vanished, likely devoured by the dying, struggling worm with a human face. It hadn't wasted any opportunity to replenish its energy, treating those decorations as emergency rations. The air inside was even thicker than at the entrance. Covering his nose and mouth with a sleeve, Saul carefully stepped over to a clean spot. He arrived at the formation he had prepared in advance to extract vengeful spirit, and narrowed his eyes at the broken form of Ralph, no longer worm-like, collapsed at its center. From the puddle of yellow grease within the formation, Saul could just faintly make out Ralph's twisted face. The arms that had once grown from his body were nowhere to be seen. Saul scanned the remains with his mental energy. There was no mental fluctuation, no magical ripple. No trace of life. Finally dead, he took a hit from a flame pearl and got dosed with a targeted antidote, yet he still held on this long. No wonder the diary said facing the big bug was certain death. He squatted down and placed a magic crystal at the edge of the formation. In an instant, the formation flared to life, as though injected with a soul, igniting with a ring of white fire. The flames spread across the ground like flowing water, gradually filling the entire formation and covering the grease. But as the white flames continued to burn, Saul's brows furrowed deeper and deeper. Nothing else happened. That's too clean, isn't it? There was no sign of Ralph's soul. Even the souls of the ordinary people he had devoured were nowhere to be found. It might be understandable if Ralph's soul didn't appear. He was strong-willed, and the small formation might be insufficient, but how could even the mercenaries' souls be missing? The white fire had no prey to consume. Once the magic crystal's energy was depleted, the fire began to sputter out. In the end, the formation dimmed under Saul's helpless gaze. Phew, I was prepared for this, but it's still disappointing. He exhaled. It had all been for nothing, just another failed experiment. But just as Saul turned to leave before the basement collapsed completely, a streak of black light suddenly shot from a toppled shelf and flew straight into the diary on his left shoulder. What? Saul was stunned. He had gone to all that trouble setting up a large formation, using up a magic crystal, yet got no reaction, only to accidentally snag a soul remnant off a shelf. The diary, aware of Saul's thoughts, floated in front of him and opened. But this time the black page it revealed was incomplete, only half a sheet. Previous black pages were always jagged and looked much rougher than the white ones. Now I'm getting half pages. What's next? Quarter pages. Are we playing Puzzle Piece Simulator? Saul complained with a groan. It wasn't the time to ask questions. With dust already falling from above, he knew he had to get out. Then came another surprise. Just as Saul reached the base of the basement entrance, a strange noise rang out from above the formation that had been quiet until now. Instinctively, Saul turned and saw a massive, grotesque spirit floating above the formation. The soul looked like a giant mass of foam formed by countless tiny bubbles, being kneaded and squeezed by invisible hands, constantly squirming. It made squelching, bubbling sounds as it moved. From the foamy mass, a disfigured soul emerged, its face missing most of its features. With a horrified expression, it opened its mouth at Saul, as if to say something, but was yanked back by an irresistible force. Saul clearly saw the soul's terror as it was absorbed, squeezed, and broken down into tiny bubbles by the larger foam. What the hell is that? Could Ralph's soul have mutated from contamination? If that grotesque thing really was Ralph's soul, then trying to absorb it into the diary was off the table. In its current state, it had clearly lost all reason, utterly corrupted. Diary, can I try attacking that thing? Diary, be my guest, go die. Fair enough, Saul immediately gave up. He looked up at the 3-meter-high exit, hoping little Algie would lift him out. But just as little Algie emerged, the once stable corrupted soul behind Saul began to convulse violently, like water about to boil. Countless wails and cries for help suddenly filled Saul's ears, then began flooding into his mind. It was like being punched in the brain by an invisible fist. Saul stumbled backward, completely disoriented. The cries in his head shifted again, turning into thousands of voices speaking at once. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Some were rational, some deranged, some sorrowful. Saul couldn't make out their words, but he could clearly feel their emotions. Yes, every single one of them. Buzz. A violent tremor surged through him as the necklace embedded in his chest began to vibrate at a high frequency. It was as if something inside Saul was banging on a locked door, trying to smash it open. Crack! The puppet on his chest split open from the top, revealing the tiny flame sealed within. The voices in his head suddenly grew quieter. Most went silent, only a few still muttering. He knew the emergency locator had bought him time. Without a second thought, Saul turned and ran. Little Algie shot forward like a grappling hook, latching onto the outer wall and transforming into a rope to pull Saul out of the basement. As soon as he landed, Saul felt the ground beneath him start to collapse, spreading outward from the entrance. He sprinted at full speed. The diary hadn't warned him that staying would be fatal, but Saul wasn't going to risk it. The staircase was already a mess, with the steps shattered into a small mountain of rubble. Little Algie surged forward and coiled around the second-floor railing. As Saul was pulled up midair, he quickly glanced over the wreckage. The staircase where Victor had been was now a deep pit, with no blood or limbs in sight. He couldn't tell whether Victor was alive or dead. Meanwhile, Klon's corpse and what was left of Swan, only his upper body, had vanished. Perhaps Ralph had eaten them too. With little Algie's help, Saul darted between beams and walls, racing against time. At last, he leapt onto the second floor just before the ground floor began sinking. Boom! A thunderous crash echoed behind him. Saul staggered, nearly losing his balance. The moment the crash landed, the whispering voices in his head grew louder again. The puppet on his chest cracked further, and the tiny flame inside began to dim. Clutching the puppet tightly, Saul ran unsteadily through the corridor. Little Algie led the way, smashing through the balcony window ahead. Saul ducked low and dove into the wind and rain. Cold rain lashed his face and body. Cracks spread across the balcony behind him, while the earth continued to sink in the distance. In the final moment, Saul stepped onto the railing and leapt. Boom! Another deafening explosion. The castle behind him caved in, dropping an entire level. The collapse unleashed a powerful shockwave that slammed into Saul's back, pelting him with flying debris. In midair, little Algie flailed its tendrils desperately, finally hooking a tree branch just before Saul hit the ground. He twisted in midair and managed to land on his feet. With little Algie giving him a final upward tug, he pulled off a safe landing. He tucked into a roll to absorb the impact. Then crack! A clear snapping sound pierced through all the noise and struck deep into Saul's core. Startled, he looked down. The puppet bound to him by the black string had shattered completely, its fragments tumbling off his skin, some even falling out of his collar. Only a single wooden thorn remained, lodged in his chest. Chapter 203, Master. Over 100 magic crystals, gone in just a few days. Saul winced. Even though he hadn't used any real magic crystals to make that temporary locator, it was all put together from his own materials. The fact that it was now destroyed still pained him. Brushing the fragments off his clothes, Saul decided to leave the area. But the moment he took a step, he suddenly saw himself collapse to the ground. Yes, saw not felt. The instant he glimpsed his own back hitting the earth, Saul's heart skipped a beat. The end realization dawned. The locator just broke, and my soul popped right out. A vague unease stirred in him. His soul always seemed too eager to leave his body. As a transmigrator, Saul couldn't help but worry. Was his body starting to give up? Little Algae had no idea what was happening. It only saw its master suddenly fall. It touched Saul's forehead with its black tendrils, finding no visible abnormalities. He just seemed asleep. This kind of thing had happened before in the Wizard Tower. But they hadn't even left the Ralph estate yet. Was this really the time for a nap? Completely unable to wake Saul up, Little Algae panicked. The castle continued to collapse, and now the destruction was starting to spread into the garden. Rocks occasionally flew through the air, landing perilously close to Saul. Little Algae could easily smack a boulder aside, but had no idea how to awaken its master. While the simple-minded Little Algae flailed in distress, Saul prepared to return to his body the usual way, by mimicking the human monster movement diagram. But the moment he lifted a foot, he noticed something spreading beneath him. A shadow. It expanded rapidly, engulfing the grass, the garden, and even his own body. Was something unimaginably massive behind him. Saul turned his head as if under compulsion, and saw the source of the shadow. It was that foam-like twisted soul from the basement, now towering like a skyscraper. What the hell is this? Saul couldn't help his curiosity. The diary hadn't issued any warnings, so he lingered to observe. Strangely, even in his soul form, facing this now enormous anomaly, he no longer heard any whispers. Just as Saul debated whether to flee or wait for a diary alert, the towering soul form suddenly shattered into countless specks and began to spin on its own under some unseen force. The sight felt familiar. Saul sucked in a breath. He was witnessing a massive soul storm on the surface. It spun faster and faster, forming a roaring cyclone that looked like it could tear the world apart. But this terrifying soul storm seemed visible only to Saul. Its fury had no effect on the physical world. Even the branches just meters away swayed, only lightly in the rain. One side apocalyptic fury, the other tranquil serenity, as if divided by a dimensional wall. Fragments of soul churned and swirled, some flung outward only to be dragged back in by a powerful pull. To Saul, those tossed out and reabsorbed shards looked like drowning people, desperately struggling to stay afloat, only to be swallowed again in silent futility. A single glance made Saul's scalp tingle. Even in soul form, he felt the chill of deep winter. No matter how this soul storm formed, don't get curious. The pull of the storm was strong, but Saul forced himself to remain rational. Curiosity killed the cat. Casting aside his curiosity, Saul began to walk. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Just as he was about to return to his body, a powerful force yanked him away. He could only watch helplessly as his physical body grew farther and farther. His soul rose higher, the plants below shrinking beneath him. Panic-stricken, Saul looked toward the Death Wizard's diary, still no reaction. The diary not working, that was the last coherent thought he had. Before being sucked into the massive soul storm, the whispers from the basement returned, flooding his mind once more. And with them came images. Saul felt himself simultaneously inhabit over 100 different lives. Birth, growth, love, hatred, family, war, wealth, death. In the span of a few breaths, Saul experienced all their joys and their bitter ends. The avalanche of memories and emotions overwhelmed him, and his consciousness vanished. Victor held his harp in both hands, standing at the storm's eye, the only calm amidst the chaos, gazing up at the terrifying spectacle above him. So many years have passed at last, a new page will form, he murmured with a smile, though the smile never reached his eyes. The world of wizards is filled with death, but is anywhere else really any better? He lifted his harp and strummed a soft note. Fate is fickle, who can guess? The living and the dead shall meet this night. No one heard his song in the wind and rain, but someone did notice the disturbance at Ralph Estate. A hawk's cry pierced the sky. Far away, the clouds split apart at the sound. Victor sensed the shift in the outside world and slowly lowered his harp. Someone's coming. The commotion really was too big, but the timing works out. He opened his arms, palms turned upward. From his hands rose tiny white crystals, floating up above his head to form a dazzling nebula. The moment the nebula took shape, the raging storm stopped instantly. Time itself seemed to pause. The massive storm, hundreds of meters tall, suddenly began to compress. In a blink, the colossal soul storm was drawn into the nebula above Victor's head. The nebula spun faster, shifting and changing forms. Everything happened so quickly that it was like watching time sped up 100-fold. Victor, calm and still below, formed a stark contrast to the chaos overhead. At last, the nebula stopped moving and compressed one final time. When the radiance faded, a golden page appeared before Victor. It was only the size of 2 palms, gold through and through, but instead of metallic coldness, it was as soft and delicate as a baby's skin. Victor's face finally showed genuine joy. He reached out with both hands, reverent and expectant, to receive the golden page. But just as the page slowly descended, it shuddered. Then vanished. Gone in a blink, without warning or reason. Victor was completely stunned. His handsome face twisted with rage. A powerful wave of mental energy instantly engulfed the Ralph estate and everything around it. The once grand estate looked like it had weathered centuries in an instant, utterly decrepit. Even the nearby plants withered and died, as if the apocalypse had arrived. But the devastating mental force came and went quickly. Victor's fury turned to suspicion and doubt. Strange, the life forms around here are all weak, nothing strong enough to steal the page. No traces of unusual magic or mental power, but that was what made it truly unusual. The page couldn't have vanished for no reason. For it to escape my control, could it be? No, it must be. Victor's mouth opened wide, his eyes bulging. Gone was the elegant air, his face was twisted with wild disbelief. But he no longer cared about appearances. It must be, his voice trembled. No, his entire body trembled. The Master has returned. Chapter 204, Second Rank. Saul dreamed that he had fallen into the ocean, thrashing desperately with a clumsy dog paddle to stay afloat. Even though he was utterly exhausted, even though his limbs were numb, he never once thought about giving up. But the seawater was bone-chilling, and wave after wave crashed over him, dragging him beneath the surface. The pain of suffocation spread from his lungs to every inch of his body. I can't sink. Only one thought remained in Saul's mind: I must survive. The more he felt the threat of death, the stronger his will to live became. As Saul continued struggling against the waves, a golden page suddenly appeared before him, floating peacefully amidst the storm. A page? Saul stared at it in surprise. Though he'd never seen a golden page before, his instincts, honed from possessing the dead wizard's diary, told him it was something good. A lifeline in his time of peril. Saul pushed against the crashing waves once more, paddling furiously toward the page. Finally, with a rise of the sea, his fingers caught the edge of the golden page. Though golden in color, the page wasn't cold or metallic. It felt soft to the touch. Yet as Saul pressed down on it to lift himself, the page, despite its softness, proved solid and supported his full weight. With both arms, he heaved himself onto the page, finally escaping the deadly, frigid waters. He lay there limply, gasping. Where is this place? I can't feel any magic. Did I travel to another world again? Saul spread out his mental power to probe his surroundings. The feedback was hazy and indistinct. He couldn't even sense the golden page through his mental perception. Doesn't feel like a different world, more like a dream. He calmed down. Looking around at the endless deep blue, almost black sea, and the pale, cloudless sky above, Saul felt a twinge of melancholy. How do I get back to the real world? No sooner had the thought crossed his mind than he felt a sudden tremor beneath him. He quickly lowered his center of gravity and grabbed the edge of the golden page. The next moment, the page shot upward like a reckless elevator, rocketing toward the sun at a terrifying speed. As it soared, the sun above grew ever closer. Saul looked up and realized it didn't look like the sun. It looked more like an exit. The brightness intensified sharply, and Saul instinctively shut his eyes. When he opened them again, he jolted awake, only to find himself being carried on someone's back at a full sprint. The person carrying him had a small mushroom growing from the top of their head. The mushroom looked a bit wilted, swaying with every step. It was the coachman who'd stayed outside waiting for him. Just then, a black tentacle reached into view. The tip of the tentacle split open like a shark's mouth, and a tongue of the same dark hue licked Saul's face. It was cool and damp. Little algae. Saul reached out and pinched its mouth, watching it sway innocently in his grasp for a few seconds before letting go. How did I get back? The person carrying Saul finally noticed he was awake. Young master. It was indeed his coachman, the one with the mushroom sprouting from his head. Saul patted his shoulder and motioned to be let down. You saved me. Saul couldn't quite believe it. The coachman shook his head repeatedly. I just saw the manor collapse and came to check on you. I found you unconscious on the ground. Afraid it was dangerous, I carried you out. Saul jumped down, inspecting himself. There didn't seem to be anything wrong. He turned to look behind and saw they had indeed left the manor. The once grand castle had crumbled into ruins, and the overwhelming soul storm that had blotted out the sky had vanished without a trace. Was it the diary that saved me? That golden page was about the same size as the pages inside. Saul looked suspiciously toward his left shoulder, where the diary still floated silently. Between its closed pages, he caught a faint glimpse of gold. Just as he was about to investigate further, he suddenly sensed someone watching him. He turned sharply toward the direction of the Ralph Manor and saw a familiar figure at the gate. It was Victor. So he's alive after all. Saul wasn't surprised in the least. But after surviving that bizarre soul storm, Saul now viewed him with even greater wariness. Victor stood under the only intact part of the gate, staring intently at Saul. His harp was nowhere to be seen. Then he stepped forward, quickening his pace as he approached Saul. Run! Saul didn't want anything to do with this shady guy. He shouted to the coachman and bolted in the opposite direction. But the footsteps behind them grew louder and faster. The da-da-da beat echoed in Saul's chest like a drum. This Victor guy is definitely connected to that soul storm somehow. Next time I need to carry at least 2 trump cards with me. Saul gritted his teeth. The diary gave no hints. He didn't know if it was broken or if he truly wasn't in any danger. Just as the two of them reached the fence at the end of the road, a glint of light flashed in Saul's eyes. In the next second, accompanied by a whooshing sound, a massive sword, over 10 meters long, slammed into the ground behind them. The earth split open, and an abandoned building on the other side began to crumble from the shockwave. The tremor flung both Saul and the coachman to the ground. Saul rolled the moment he hit the dirt. His first reaction was to check Victor. Victor looked just as startled. The giant sword had landed barely a few centimeters away from him, clearly aimed in his direction. But instead of immediately reacting to the sword's owner, Victor glanced at Saul. There was something in that look, a hint of scrutiny, as if he were confirming something. Then Victor backed away again. Another enormous sword crashed down on the very spot he'd just vacated. This time it hit with even more force, burying 2/3 of its blade in the earth. Then came the screech of an eagle. A massive bird dove toward the ground, then pulled up sharply before impact. Just before it soared away again, a tall, slender figure leapt from its back. It was a woman with short, cropped golden hair. The moment she landed, she placed both hands on the two swords embedded in the ground. The once rigid blades instantly turned to a liquid mercury-like substance, reformed in her hands, and solidified again, this time as two 3-meter-long greatswords. Though clearly heavy and too large for normal warriors to wield, the woman swung them effortlessly like they were toys. Saul recognized her. She was Kira, the most powerful wizard currently in the Kema. At first, he just thought she looked familiar, but after a moment he remembered. She was the second-rank wizard who had visited the Wizard Tower 2 years ago. She left a strong impression, especially since she dared speak bluntly even to the Tower Master. Now 2 years later, she felt even more formidable. Kira didn't even glance at Saul. She raised both swords, pointing them at Victor, ready to strike at any moment. She looked more like a warrior than a wizard. Victor had just retreated to a distance of 3 meters. As Kira leveled her blades, one of the sword tips came dangerously close to his face. He arched his brow and took 2 more steps back. A sign of yielding, perhaps. If it were Saul, he wouldn't attack a mysterious opponent right away, either. But Kira was clearly a different breed. Seeing Victor retreat, she didn't lower her sword. Her body radiated killing intent as she barked coldly. A second-rank wizard entering another second-rank wizard's territory without permission can be considered an act of war. Battle Maniac Wizard Kira. Chapter 205. My name is. Second rank. Saul's heart sank. That Victor was actually a second rank. Then all his previous resistance and counterattacks must have seemed like a joke to the man. Saul's expression darkened. Being toyed with like this was not a pleasant feeling. More importantly, a stranger who was a second-rank wizard, disguising himself as a second-rank apprentice, had secretly infiltrated the Wizard Tower's territory. What exactly was he plotting? What could a fallen noble family possibly have that was worth a second-rank wizard scheming for? Saul lowered his eyes. If he truly was a second rank, he wouldn't have been stopped by the basement's formation. The butler's head also wouldn't have been enough to preserve the Bloodthorn family's inheritance, so he's not here for the family's legacy. Then the answer must lie in the soul storm just now. Only something as massive as that storm would be valuable enough to draw in another second rank, like Wizard Kira. A soul storm was made up mostly of fragments of the dead souls. Had this tiny Ralph estate already claimed so many lives? If not for that sudden golden page, Saul probably would have become one of the storm's undead as well. That golden page seemed to have been taken in by the diary. But now wasn't the time to check. Kira and Victor looked about ready to fight. Saul had to be careful not to get caught in the crossfire. He took 2 steps back and bumped his heel against the fence blocking the road. Victor, facing the imposing Kira, also stepped back twice. He spread his hands and flashed a harmless smile. No need to be so tense. I didn't come here to offend the Wizard Tower or the Kema. Kira didn't relax in the slightest. In fact, she seemed eager to fight, as though she were itching for it. State your name, origin, and purpose. She fired off her questions bluntly. But before Victor could reply, she suddenly turned into a blur and charged forward with incredible speed. Let me introduce myself, Whoa! Victor had barely opened his mouth when sword lights filled his vision, and a barrage of killing intent came at him from all directions. From Saul's hiding spot, he couldn't even track Kira's movements. Her speed had clearly surpassed the limits of normal human endurance. Is this Kira really a wizard? She feels more like a warrior. Victor, caught in the middle, barely dodged the first two strikes before shouting, attacking during a negotiation. That's extremely unreasonable. Kira thrust forward with her sword again, replying coldly, On my turf, I decide what's reasonable. This time, the tip of her sword unleashed an invisible wave of sword energy, piercing through Victor's left shoulder cleanly. Yet Victor remained calm, casually flicking the invisible sword energy with his fingers, causing it to disperse. Though blood welled up from the wound, it stopped almost immediately. Kira wasn't discouraged. With a jolt of her arms, the greatsword around her surged with invisible sword energy once more. The energy distorted the air itself, and Saul, standing nearby, felt a stinging pain in his eyes just from the pressure. He hastily circulated his magic to shield himself from the nearly tangible magical radiation. Beside him, the coachman had already ducked and curled up into a ball, burying his head between his knees, a life-saving instinct honed by experience. It was the only thing an ordinary person could do in a fight between two second-rank wizards. Kira didn't spare either of the bystanders a glance. Her twin swords, bolstered by the sword energy, were now massive like door panels. They hardly even looked like swords anymore. Each strike came down with the force of a raging storm. Victor, bearing the brunt of the pressure, knew he'd be sliced to ribbons if he didn't fight back soon. As the enormous blade came crashing down, Victor's body began to tremble. Buzz! A low, muffled hum echoed out. The sound rattled Saul's mind, making his thoughts swirl. He immediately looked up, realizing Victor was about to retaliate. Victor raised both palms and met Kira's sword energy head-on. At the instant of contact, the storm-like energy simply vanished. Kira blinked in surprise but didn't stop. In fact, she moved even faster, her swinging arms now cutting through the air with a howling noise. Yet no matter where her sword energy landed on Victor, it dissipated instantly, unable to do any real damage. Kira started to get a sense of what was happening, though she hadn't fully pieced it together yet. Still, she wasn't worried. She enjoyed figuring out her opponent's weaknesses during battle. Saul, watching nervously from the side, was getting anxious. Victor's only defending. Looks like his energy drain is way less than Kira's. If this keeps up, will Kira be the one to run out of magic first? Though neither wizard was yet fighting at full force, the ground beneath them was already crumbling from the pressure. After thinking it over, Saul narrowed his eyes and activated his meditation technique. The scene before him changed. Under Saul's perception, Victor was covered in a dense, highly compressed white energy membrane that vibrated at an intense frequency. On the other side, Kira kept swinging her gate-sized swords, trying to pierce that membrane. But every time she touched it, her sword would tremble and crack apart instantly. From the outside, it looked as though her attacks were being neutralized the moment they touched Victor. Saul only looked twice before his eyes began to burn, tears instantly welling up and spilling over. He rubbed his eyes frantically while shouting, "Lady Kira, it's a vibration. Victor's using sound-based attacks to confuse people, and sound at its core is vibration." Kira picked up on it immediately, not being slow-witted herself. Both Victor and Kira looked over at Saul. Kira's gaze was a bit surprised. She hadn't expected him to interrupt a battle between second-rank wizards, even if they weren't going all out. Victor, on the other hand, had a flicker of fondness in his eyes. Startled, Saul quickly convinced himself it was just a momentary blur from rubbing his eyes. He must have seen wrong. This guy's intentions are unclear. I hope Kira can take him down quickly. Saul silently cheered for her, especially worried that Victor might be connected to that golden page. Kira turned back around and, with a jolt of her hands, dismissed the sword energy. Seeing her stop, Victor smiled. There's no need for us to fight, really. You must be Kira, the current Duchess of Kema. What a coincidence, our names are quite similar. Victor tried once again to introduce himself, but all that greeted him was another merciless blow. While he was talking, Kira's massive sword suddenly melted, not to grow larger but to shrink and spread across her arms. Though it had shrunk, it looked even more solid. At a glance, it was as if her arms themselves had turned into a pair of deadly blades. The transformation happened in a blink, and she lunged forward again, ending Victor's introduction attempt with a sharp thrust. Victor dodged awkwardly once more. Aren't you supposed to be a noble? Kira ignored him completely and kept attacking, every strike aimed at a vital point. Victor's wounds were clearly piling up, yet he still didn't counterattack. That left Saul completely confused, still ready to bolt at a moment's notice in case the fight spilled his way. Does he have some kind of restriction on him? Then Saul saw Kira land a hit that sent Victor flying, soaring far away. But she didn't look satisfied. Fight back already. She was about to chase after him when Victor, still mid-air, flipped mid-flight and somehow landed atop the withered branch of a large tree. From behind his back, he pulled out a harp and plucked a note. Saul immediately covered his ears. But Victor's voice still slipped through. What an unrefined lady, Victor said as he strummed and softly sang. Kira launched herself into the air. But the moment she jumped, an invisible force smacked her back down. Lucky for you, I'm in a good mood today, so I won't hold your rudeness against you. Remember my name, I am. Boom! Kira landed with both hands slammed into the earth, and just as Victor was singing away, she tore up a huge chunk of earth and stone and hurled it at the treetop. A storm of dust and rubble exploded into the air, obscuring Saul's view. I persisted. Saul craned his neck, trying to get a better look, and he could just make out what seemed like the usually elegant Victor, cursing. My name is what again? Chapter 206, Wood and Mushrooms. Kira was nothing like a grand noble of a duchy. She charged into the dust and sand alone, completely unconcerned by the filth. However, it didn't take long before she rushed back out again. With a guarded expression, she scanned her surroundings. One of her arms had transformed into a short sword, raised defensively in front of her. But once the dust settled, she couldn't find any trace of Victor. Ran off. She sounded disappointed as she retracted her weapons. The two greatswords melted into liquid and flowed along her arms, vanishing into her sleeves. Despite the size of the swords, Kira's figure remained unchanged. Saul couldn't tell where she had stored such massive weapons. Hiding behind a pile of debris, Saul stood up. Seeing the proud second-rank wizard approaching, he hurriedly kicked the coachman, who was still curled up on the ground. That second rank, whoever he is, why was he after you, and who exactly are you? Saul quickly pulled out his apprentice badge and held it up for Kira to see. Lady Kira, I'm a tower apprentice. I came here for an external mission and happened upon him by accident. He seems to have been lurking here for some time, harming both commoners and wandering wizards. Kira glanced at his badge and curled her lips slightly, as if unimpressed. But then, as if something occurred to her, she gave a cold, humorless smile. Provoking an unknown second-rank wizard, that's no small matter. I'll take you back to the tower. Let your tower master interrogate you properly." As soon as she finished speaking, she raised her right hand and snapped her fingers. Instead of the usual sound of skin and bone, Kira's snap rang out like metal clashing. Her words left Saul speechless. If stepping into Victor's trap by accident counted as provoking him, then what was Kira doing by repeatedly charging in with giant swords, ignoring all warnings? Picking a fight, aggro bait. Still, she was a second-rank wizard. Saul knew better than to argue. A giant bird descended from the sky. As it neared the ground, Kira grabbed Saul, small and skinny, and leapt directly onto the bird's back with him. The bird's back was uneven and had no saddle or anything to sit on. Kira stood steadily atop it with no difficulty. Saul, on the other hand, was having a miserable time. He could only lie flat, clutching the bird's feathers with both hands to avoid sliding off. But the feathers were smooth and slick, offering no grip at all. Up front, Kira seemed lost in thought. Apart from shielding them from wind resistance, she simply stood there silently, offering no help. Saul sighed, realizing he couldn't count on the battle maniac. He muttered a chant and cast a rarely used adhesion spell, sticking his rear and thighs firmly to the bird's back so he wouldn't fall. Only after ensuring he was secure did he start to worry about others. The coachman had apparently been left behind again. As the bird ascended rapidly, the figure on the ground grew smaller and smaller. Once they were out of communication range, Saul could only wave at the coachman below, signaling him to return to the tower on his own. The coachman helplessly watched Saul vanish into the sky with the terrifying second-rank wizard. He was a bit worried for the kind young apprentice, but he knew he had no right to intervene. He shook the mushroom on his head, then deftly climbed over the barrier and debris blocking the road and headed for the carriage parked under a nearby eave. The horses raised by the tower were all excellent. Even after the massive commotion, the steed merely shifted restlessly and hadn't bolted. The coachman patted the horse's mane to calm it down, then climbed into the driver's seat and tugged the reins to turn the carriage around. The earlier chaos had plunged the entire town of Sop into an eerie silence. Not a single resident came out to investigate. Every door was shut tight, with people hiding inside. The carriage rolled smoothly out of the town and onto the countryside road leading to the tower. Beneath the coachman's feet, amid a pile of miscellaneous items, lay a small, dust-covered jar. As the carriage bumped along, the jar occasionally gave off the crisp clink of coins rattling inside. After the coachman left the town, where the Ralph estate once stood, the sky above the ruins gradually cleared. Sunlight once again bathed the land, illuminating the remains of the destroyed Ralph estate. Suddenly, a stone slab on the ground tilted upward. A hand reached out and slowly pushed the slab aside. A boy, looking even younger than Saul, crawled out from underground, clutching a small, common spell pouch in his hand. The pouch bulged with contents, clearly filled with quite a bit. Once fully emerged, the boy revealed a wooden lower body. The waist down was just a flat stump of wood. If Saul were still here, he would immediately recognize this boy as Swan, a first-rank apprentice and student of third-rank apprentice Klon. But now Swan no longer looked terrified or dazed. His expression was complex. Once he was sure no one else was around, Swan began chanting a spell fluently. With the incantation, two thick branches sprouted from his wooden waist. They straightened forcefully, replacing his legs and feet, allowing him to stand. He exhaled in relief and set the heavy pouch on the ground before wiping the grass-scented sweat from his forehead. Opening the pouch, he saw a pile of broken shards. Damn, it's broken again. This time it's too busted to fix. Wonder if the land drifters will buy scrap. But when he saw the magic crystals, gold coins, gemstones, and a few books under the broken bits, he grinned widely. Still a decent haul today. More than enough to buy a new mentor. Maybe this time I'll get a female one. Swan licked his lips and briefly drifted into fantasy. But as he looked around at the ruins again, he reined in his excitement, closed the pouch, and slung it over his shoulder. Better get out of here fast. 2 second ranks showing up at once, way too scary. Good thing they had no interest in a third-rank apprentice like me. Thinking of Victor, who had lured him to the castle's 4th floor, and that terrifying female he never even saw, Swan shivered and hurried away. But when he reached the end of the road and saw the small, run-down house beyond the fence, he remembered something. Crap, I think I gave that old hag a gold coin when I was gathering intel earlier. I've lost so much already, I can't afford to waste money like that. Convincing himself, he headed toward the old woman's home at the roadside. But when he got there, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. A warning bell went off in his mind. Carefully avoiding the door, he peeked inside through a nearby window. And what he saw made his eyes go wide. The old woman was still sitting on her little stool, facing the door. But her entire body was covered in white mushrooms, densely packed and deeply unsettling. Only her slightly cloudy eyes remained visible, staring expectantly at the doorway. The pile of clutter behind the mushroom-covered figure had been disturbed, especially the old jar once full of coins, now nowhere to be seen. Swan slowly backed away, retreating 10 meters before hastily casting a cleansing spell on himself, terrified he might have picked up something foul. Someone beat me to it. Who the hell is so greedy and shameless they'd even steal from regular folks? He cursed internally, no longer daring to linger as he quickened his pace away from the street. Now, the area around the street where the Ralph estate had stood was completely devoid of life. Kiera's mount flew fast, though not as fast as when she had first arrived with thunderous force. She had probably been startled by Victor's flashy display and used Nitro Boost to rush over just in case. "Thank you for saving me today." Saul finally found a chance to speak as they burst through the clouds. Kiera didn't even look back. "Saving you was just incidental. Do you know the name of that second-rank wizard? So you beat him up and chased him off, and now you think to ask." Chapter 207. Say that again and I'll kill you. I only know his name is Victor, though that likely isn't his real name. He'd been hiding at the Bloodthorn family's Ralph Manor for a long time. He lured many people into the castle, where the mutated Ralph devoured them. But I don't know the exact reason why he did all that, Saul said truthfully. After a pause, he also told Kiera about Victor's most terrifying ability. Victor might not be as powerful as you in a direct fight, but he seems to be able to cloud people's awareness and memory. When I first entered Ralph Manor, I inexplicably mistook him for my older brother. It took a while before I realized I had fallen under his influence. Just as he finished speaking, Saul saw Kiera, who had been standing with her back to him in a carefree pose, suddenly turn around in surprise. Of course, the moment Kiera met Saul's gaze, she immediately wiped the astonishment from her face. Even though he hid his power and suppressed his magic, he's still a second-rank wizard. For you to break free from his control, are you Gorsa's student? How was he supposed to answer that? Saul hadn't yet received formal acknowledgement from the Tower Master, so he went with a more tactful reply. The Tower Master has indeed taught me many things. Kiera, being straightforward, took that as a confirmation. He doesn't care about other people's apprentices at all. You must be his student. That makes you the 5th one, I think. Hopefully, your ending will be better than the others. Kiera started to take Saul more seriously. You look so skinny and small. How old are you? 14. Tusk, Kiera scoffed in disgust. So young. How much time does Gorsa plan to waste raising another test subject? Test subject? Saul jumped in surprise and quickly asked, Lady Kiera, What do you mean by test subject? Kira didn't seem at all flustered about letting something slip. She just waved her hand casually. Don't worry about it. True wizards don't train newcomers just to share knowledge out of the kindness of their hearts. They're not that generous. Either they want to train an assistant or they want to cultivate materials. As for what kind of apprentices will become in the end, it depends on their own abilities and in what way they can help the wizards. Kira clearly didn't find the topic alarming, even though any ordinary apprentice would likely panic at hearing something like that. Lady Kira, Saul said carefully, I know the Tower Master is conducting a complicated experiment. I wonder if I could be of help to him. Right now, absolutely not. Even Gorsa's last 3 apprentices didn't seem to stand a chance, but your mental power is quite exceptional. Maybe once you advance to a true wizard, you'll be able to help. A touch of melancholy appeared on Kira's face. He's waited this many years already. Maybe he really will succeed. So Kira knew what Gorsa was working on. Could it be the Tower Master truly wants to bring Lady Yura back to life? He always seemed so gentle. It was hard to imagine him as someone driven by such deep passion. Lady Kira, do you know Lady Yura? Kira turned away. Saul couldn't see her expression. Ah, of course I do. She was my cousin, your Tower Master's wife. The kind of person who, once she got stubborn, made you want to strangle her. Perhaps the mention of Yura made Kira emotional or upset, because she didn't say another word for the rest of the trip, nor did she give Saul a chance to ask anything else. Kira's cold, imposing presence forced Saul to shut up for now. After all, if he annoyed her too much, she could just toss him off the giant bird. The two of them, riding the giant bird, arrived at their destination in less than an hour. That simple, lonely silhouette of the wizard tower appeared before Saul. It made him appreciate how useful flying mounts really were. Saul was already fantasizing about the day he became powerful enough to get his own big flying bird for transportation or for showing off. As they approached the wizard tower, Kira guided the giant bird downward. As one of the few second-rank wizards in the Western continent, Kira didn't need to enter the tower like a regular apprentice through one of the 2 ground entrances. She flew straight to the top of the tower with Saul in tow. Just as the giant bird's talons gripped the railing at the top of the tower, Gorsa emerged from a small door on the rooftop. Saul quickly undid his adhesion spell and leapt off the bird's back. Tower Master, he walked over and respectfully bowed to Gorsa. The Tower Master, wrapped in a reddish-brown cloak, nodded and motioned for Saul to stand behind him. Saul hurried over. Only then did Kira dismount from the giant bird. The soul storm broke out way closer to your wizard tower. I arrived all the way over here, and you still hadn't shown up. Kira raised her chin and suddenly smirked. Don't tell me, you're really mutating. Gorsa's face was hidden beneath his hood. Saul couldn't see his expression. But he heard Gorsa's gentle voice, calm and slow. Say that again and I'll kill you. Kira's mocking expression froze. She didn't press the issue about Gorsa's health any further and instead pointed at Saul. A stranger who's a second-rank wizard shows up in your territory, and you don't care. I even went out of my way to rescue your promising student. So, thank you, Gorsa nodded slightly. You can leave now. Kira. I'll handle the rest myself, Gorsa said, his tone still flat, as if he had no idea how insulting his words sounded. Kira immediately flared up. I personally brought him all the way here instead of just leaving him there, and you think all I want is a thank you. Gorsa replied, Did you fight the intruder? Kira paused. Then what more do you want? Gorsa's voice had a hint of amusement. Don't tell me you've started taking an interest in other people's schemes. Kira rubbed her chin, thought for a moment, and actually jumped back onto her giant bird. I'm not interested, no, But I'm not stupid either. If anyone dares set their sights on Kemma's territory, I'll slice them into pieces." She waved her fist at Gorsa. Gorsa nodded obligingly. "When the enemy shows up, I'll let you know." Kira seemed satisfied with that. Before she left, she looked at Saul one more time. "Hopefully, this new apprentice of yours turns out better than those useless ones before. And if you ever decide to give up on him, just let me know. I'll come take Yura away." Gorsa said nothing. Kira stared at him for a moment, then felt like leaving just like that was a bit too lame, so she clenched her fists and added, "Or when I surpass you, I'll take her away then." With that final threat, she didn't wait for a reaction and quickly took off on her bird. Only after Kira disappeared into the sky did Gorsa turn toward Saul and give him a once-over. "Soul and body divergence is increasing, compatibility's dropping. Your situation is getting worse. Still haven't figured out a solution." "I have an idea." Saul lowered his head slightly, though his mind was still on what Kira had said, mutation. In the wizarding world, mutation was a term often associated with contamination. Could the Tower Master's body really be failing? Gorsa noticed Saul's unease and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Let's talk inside. It seems this trip exposed you to some unexpected dangers. If nothing goes wrong." Chapter 208, Kismet. The moment Gorsa's hand landed on Saul's shoulder, Saul felt himself sinking. It was a strange sensation, like passing through a curtain of water or like popping a bubble. As he crossed that thin membrane, Saul vaguely saw countless eyes watching him and Gorsa. Those eyes were densely packed, one right next to the other. The pupils were as tiny as pinpricks, and as Saul sank deeper, their gaze shifted with him. The moment Saul made eye contact with those eyes, an inexplicable fear and unease gripped him. It felt like someone was repeatedly punching his heart, suffocating and oppressive. Then everything went dark and light again. When he came to, he was back in the second storage room. That eerie feeling of being watched had vanished. In front of him were the familiar ranks of corpses. Behind him, the towering shelves. Was that teleportation just now? Why could I perceive the process of spatial transition this time when I never could before? He didn't have time to dwell on it. Gorsa was already speaking. "Tell me what happened at Ralph Estate." Saul paused to gather his thoughts and organize his words. "After entering the estate, I encountered a strange man. He had a terrifying ability. He could manipulate people's consciousness or memories." Saul briefly recounted his entire experience at the estate, focusing especially on Victor's abilities and behavior. He downplayed the difficulty of concocting the antidote and omitted Morden's assistance. As expected, after hearing Saul's account, Gorsa's first question was about Victor's oddity. "You said he played the harp." Gorsa tapped his temple lightly with a finger wrapped in pink. "What kind of harp was it?" Saul froze. He had no idea how to answer that. He tried to recall it carefully, but couldn't remember what the harp even looked like. "Maybe it wasn't a harp," Gorsa said, his tone unusually serious. "Victor, he always talked about fate, spoke in strange patterns, and didn't like to kill with his own hands. I think I know who he is." "Huh, does the Tower Master know him?" "His name is Kismet. He's not from the Western continent. Back in my homeland, many had seen this wizard. There was a rumor at the time. Wherever he appeared, catastrophic mass deaths would follow. That's why some called him the Harbinger of Death." The Harbinger of Death. Saul was truly stunned this time. Victor, no, Kismet's title immediately brought to mind the dead wizard's diary. Why had Kismet hidden his identity and gone to Ralph Estate in secret? And that golden page that saved him from the soul storm, could it have something to do with Kismet's arrangements? Saul clenched his fingers tightly, his knuckles trembling and making a faint clicking sound. Gorsa happened to fall silent at that moment, so the clicking became very audible. Scared, Gorsa chuckled softly. But Saul took a deep breath and slowly calmed down. Yes, he admitted his intense fear without hesitation. It was the unease from facing an enemy with unknown power and purpose. He also worried about the possible connection between Victor and that golden page. If it were just Seed, a second-rank apprentice, Saul could seek help to deal with him. But if a second-rank wizard also knew of the diary, Saul didn't know whether he could protect the secret, nor if Kismet might be able to find it by following some subtle clues. And now that the golden page seemed to have merged into the diary, Saul didn't dare check it right away. He was constantly under the eyes of powerful wizards. His anxiety made his heart pound restlessly. You don't need to worry too much. I'll send someone to investigate. In the meantime, stay in the wizard tower and don't take on any field missions. Yes, Saul nodded quickly, then hesitated. Tower Master, how powerful is a second-rank wizard really? He asked cautiously, unsure if the Tower Master would avoid the question or think he wasn't ready for it. Seeing the nervous apprentice, Gorsa gave a soft laugh. He snapped his fingers, and two single-seater sofas appeared behind them. They looked extremely soft, like they could swallow a person whole. If you want to talk about this, I suggest you sit down first, Gorsa said and took a seat. Only his movements were stiff. His arms and legs were rigidly positioned, making him look nothing like someone enjoying a comfy chair. Saul gripped the armrest and slowly sat down. He sank into the sofa instantly, overwhelmed by its comfort, like he'd never want to stand up again. This sofa is filled with materials that help stabilize mental strength. I can leave one for you. If you ever feel like you're about to go insane, you can sit down and reflect on your life. Gorsa's tone was light, but the content was chilling. Okay. Saul mimicked Gorsa's posture, placing his hands on the armrests and resting his feet on the footstool below. But he couldn't relax in front of the Tower Master. Suddenly, he felt like he wasn't lying on a soft sofa, but in a coffin lined with thick padding. Looks like you're ready. Then let me give you a brief rundown of the wizard hierarchy. Gorsa's voice turned calm and steady, like a lullaby. I didn't talk about this before because I didn't want you all fantasizing about high-tier powers while still weak. That would lead you astray, blinding you to your own growth. But since you've been interacting with people beyond your level, it's better if I give you a basic overview. That way, when you encounter a powerful enemy, at least you can try to prepare. Prepare, Saul repeated. He looked at the Tower Master, struggling to imagine how knowing their strength could possibly help him prepare. Gorsa slowly raised one finger and waved it slightly. See if you can call for help, flee, or fight to the death. Or, if it comes down to it, at least prepare a quick way to die, preferably one that destroys your soul entirely. Saul pressed his lips shut. He'd never thought of preparing a clean death for himself, like a suicide warrior. No need to feel ashamed or discouraged. I've prepared a way out for myself, too. I don't want to be some grunt for someone else after I'm dead. Even the Tower Master had a self-destruction method. Does that mean the more powerful a wizard is, the more they fear death? But Tower Master, you're saying this while facing a room full of corpses. Doesn't that make you feel guilty? Saul sneaked a glance at the diary on his left shoulder, then quickly looked away. He thought of Morden, whose consciousness had been shattered in the soul storm, and of Bill and the others, still working for him after death. Maybe I could make a deal with Diary Bro. If I die, he could store my consciousness inside the diary. Besides the fact that it'd get a little hazy and I'd grow dumb, it wouldn't be such a bad way to go. Wait, hazy consciousness. A thought flashed through Saul's mind, connecting the diary's power and Victor's methods. He slowly clenched his teeth until pain, and the metallic taste of blood rose from his gums. Was it just a coincidence? Victor's abilities felt eerily similar to the diary in some ways. So, was there a deeper connection between them? Chapter 209, The Evolution of an Egg. Gorsa considerately gave Saul a moment to wrestle with his thoughts. Once he saw Saul's eyes gradually turn resolute, he smiled and continued explaining. As wizard apprentices, you're in the preliminary stage before becoming a true wizard. Whether you're first rank, second rank, or third rank, there's no essential difference. Maybe your magic is a bit stronger, maybe you've learned a few more spells, but in the eyes of a true wizard, you're still as fragile as a peeled egg. There's only that thin membrane resisting the outside world, and a gust of wind might be all it takes to break it. That's why, during the apprenticeship stage, having a relatively stable learning environment is crucial for survival. You might think the death rate within the wizard tower is high, but that's because you haven't seen what the lives of wandering apprentices are like out there. Sure, those who survive constant brushes with death might become exceptionally strong, but there are very few survivors. That's also why low-ranking wizards always tend to band together, forming all sorts of organizations. As an apprentice, what you need to do is build a solid foundation of knowledge, then gradually broaden your horizons. From there, you determine the focus of your magical research, and based on that, choose your locator. Hearing this, Saul shifted uncomfortably. His locator hadn't been chosen based on his research focus. It had come as part of the starter pack he received after transmigrating. Though coincidentally, everything he researched revolved around death and souls. Next comes the complete fusion of your locator, making it part of yourself, not just physically but soul as well. At that point, your egg has essentially been boiled. Your resistance to attacks increases significantly compared to your apprentice days, but even then, your strength is mostly just overwhelming to ordinary people. When it comes to magical creatures, you're still only on par with their infant stages. That's why first-rank wizards often use various methods to strengthen themselves. And by then, their bodies and minds are capable of withstanding the negative effects brought on by those enhancements. Following Gorsa's example, Saul imagined it. Maybe a first-rank wizard is trying hard to turn himself into from boiled egg to a preserved egg. After a short pause, Gorsa continued. If a first-rank wizard focuses mostly on exerting influence within and around their own body, then a second-rank wizard's sphere of influence is much wider. They can also withstand much stronger radiation, corruption, and contamination. Let me give you another example. If your mentor Kez can kill 10 people with a wave of his hand, then I, with a serious strike, could wipe out an entire army of hundreds. And if I got creative, I could kill thousands, perhaps even more. Saul's jaw dropped. The power gap between wizard ranks was even more massive than he'd imagined. It's like a first-rank wizard evolved from a preserved egg to an iron egg, and at the same time, armed with a submachine gun. Then a second-rank wizard might be a metallic pill, controlling a remote missile. As for those beyond second rank, Gorsa smacked his lips, you've been to Hanging Hand Valley, do you know its history? Saul had heard it from Senior Byron. A third-rank wizard had lifted an entire mountain, destroying a whole wizard army. Even a second-rank wizard, former Emperor Morden, hadn't survived. After his death, he became a wraith, eventually tricked by the diary into being a tool. At that point, the egg analogy stopped making sense. Maybe it wasn't an egg anymore. It had become a bomb. As for fourth rank, Gorsa's gaze turned wistful in a way it hadn't when he spoke of third rank. I've never met one, but it said they're beings who have transcended death. Truly killing a fourth-rank wizard is extremely difficult. They're like mushrooms, cut one down and another pops up. Gorsa chuckled lightly. I remember there used to be a joke about low-ranking apprentices being called white mushrooms, but once someone reaches fourth rank, they're actually more like white mushrooms than the apprentices ever were. Anything beyond that fifth rank, sixth rank is only ever mentioned in old texts. Gorsa paused. You don't need to concern yourself with that. I'll never even meet one. Saul gave a wry smile. He wasn't all that eager to learn how powerful 5th or 6th rank wizards were anyway. Knowing might just make him more afraid. Like knowing a meteor strike could wipe out the world, and learning that there are already a few meteors hovering overhead, just waiting for a bad mood to fall from the sky. You'd end up living every day in dread. So sometimes, knowing too much only leads to cognitive overload and damage that sneaks in quietly. Still immersed in the new knowledge he'd just absorbed, Saul suddenly heard the Tower Master speak. Really, I'm telling you all this now just to broaden your view a little. While you're in the Wizard Tower, you don't need to worry too much about those stronger than you. Saul stared at the Tower Master, sensing that he was saying, "Don't worry, I've got your back." He just couldn't be sure if that back was covered by a shield or a pot lid. The mixed message left Saul feeling conflicted. He didn't know whether to be grateful or on guard. He took a deep breath. As long as he kept growing stronger and used the diary to eliminate the threat of death, he wouldn't have to worry about others' intentions, good or bad. If they were kind, he could repay them. If they were malicious, he'd return it tenfold. Saul looked up at the Tower Master and smiled. I understand now, Tower Master. No matter why Victor or Kismet appeared at the Ralph estate, what I should be focusing on now is my own studies and research. Next, I'll dedicate myself to studying the locator and advancing to the 3rd rank apprentice. Gorsa stood up straight from the sofa and looked down at Saul from above. What you should prioritize now is resolving the growing incompatibility between your soul and body. I suggest refining your soul resin plan and focusing on improving your physical quality. Saul, Gorsa said gently but solemnly, your soul has already far outpaced your body. I hope you remember the importance of the flesh. If you have no ideas, look into Ralph's flesh-crafting magic for reference. Ralph's flesh-crafting magic, Saul was stunned. Though he had inherited the Bloodthorn family's legacy, he hadn't yet consciously linked it with his soul resin plan. That was because he had just returned and hadn't calmly reviewed his latest adventure. Tower Master, 2 years ago you severely wounded Ralph. Did you do it so I could bring back the flesh-crafting magic? Gorsa didn't deny it. The Bloodthorn family's flesh-crafting magic is quite interesting. Among dark element wizards, they're one of the few who truly focus on the body. A thought struck Saul. So, do all dark element wizards suffer from soul-body incompatibility? Was this what Mentor Kaz had once hinted at, the danger that came with knowledge? Gorsa nodded. That's a common ailment among dark element wizards, I'd say. They always believe the soul is the superior subject of study. You're not the first apprentice to face this problem, and you won't be the last, but your case is more severe than most I've seen. It's as if your body, Tusk, doesn't really like your soul. Saul could guess why. This body wasn't originally his. It had bonded with the original Saul for 12 years, and only been with him for just over 2. It was understandable that it might resist. Saul suddenly turned to look back at the corpses. Those people were long dead, yet a trace of chaotic consciousness still seemed to linger in their remains. Could it be that the original Saul's soul is still inside my body? Saul pressed his lips tightly together. If that's true, it must be purged. He absolutely wouldn't allow anyone else to share his body, not even a sliver of residual consciousness. Even though the original Saul was innocent, Saul wasn't the one who killed him either. If it weren't for him, this body, with whatever lingering consciousness it had, would already be in the ground fertilizing flowers. Chapter 210, Soul Resin 2 Plan. Watching Saul's shifting expression with interest, Gorsa knew the boy must have thought of something. Ever since he discovered the abnormality in Saul's soul, he had taken an interest in this little apprentice. The times he had intervened from the shadows were merely to see how far this strange yet gifted talent could go. If Saul could truly grow stronger, perhaps one day he could actually be of help to Gorsa. Since you've made your decision, then don't leave the second warehouse until you've resolved your soul separation issue. Saul was momentarily stunned. Don't leave the second warehouse. But what about the tasks assigned to him by his mentors? He had even applied for leave the last time he went outside the tower and had informed the other mentors as well. Tower Master, but I still have tasks. It's not a problem. You can do the sorting work inside the warehouse. I'll assign you an assistant to handle the deliveries. Saul hesitated. This arrangement didn't quite match the reason he had chosen the second warehouse in the first place. The job wasn't just about using some of the warehouse's materials. It was also about increasing his interactions with various mentors. But then he thought again. If he couldn't properly resolve his soul separation problem, he probably wouldn't be able to manage this job much longer anyway. I understand, Tower Master. I'll finish the new soul resin modification as soon as I can. Saul had also made up his mind. If he delayed any further, his body might deteriorate even more. Good. In fact, this is your true reward for passing Ralph's trial, Gorsa said with a smile. But accidents always happen. Not even I can guard against everything. I'm glad you made it back alive after encountering Kismet. Keep growing stronger, Saul. Don't squander your misfortune. Don't squander misfortune, seriously. Saul could only give a wry smile and nod. When he looked up again, Gorsa had already vanished along with the couch he had been sitting on. True to his word, he had left Saul a couch behind. Saul relaxed from the rigid posture he had been holding, sinking into the soft cushions, thinking about what he should do next. Soul resin, flesh crafting. Could it be that the soul resin's physical properties are too fragile, and its boost to mental and magic power too strong, making my remaining physical body even more incompatible with my soul? Then, what if I went further with the fleshcraft spell and performed a more extreme modification on myself? As a transmigrator, Saul's incompatibility between soul and body was more pronounced than that of other Dark Element apprentices. And judging from how frequently he was experiencing soul separation now, the consequences were much more severe. If he couldn't resolve this issue, one day it could very well become his death sentence. And the reason the diary hadn't given him any warning was likely because that fatal moment was still far in the future. Complete a second soul resin modification, and while I'm at it, I should also check if any trace of the original soul remains within me. A smile slowly appeared on Saul's face, his bony fingertips gently tracing a circle on his temple. As he mulled things over, a chill suddenly crept up the back of his neck. He stood up abruptly and looked behind him. But all he saw were the corpses standing with their backs to him, nothing else. The closest ones were the newly added corpses of Bill and Herman. Thinking of Bill, who had been completely erased, and Herman, whose consciousness was barely clinging on, Saul had a sudden realization. What exactly are these corpses? Saying they're dead doesn't quite fit. Some seem to retain fragments of awareness. Saul recalled the scene where the corpse group had been drawn to candlelight and even rushed out of the warehouse. He couldn't help but question, were they really dead? Could it be that their bodies still housed some trace of pre-death consciousness? If the bodies of the dead could indeed retain some remnant of their former minds, then it would make sense that a fragment of the original soul might still exist within Saul. Maybe he could use these corpses to try extracting their remaining soul fragments, and then, by extension, determine whether his body contained another soul besides his own. Returning to his workbench, Saul pretended to pick up his notes for study. In truth, he was summoning the dead wizard's diary. Just as he expected, the diary floated open before him. This time, its dark red hard leather cover slowly flipped open, settling on the first page. It was an ordinary blank sheet of paper, but written across it in blood-red script were the words, Master Death, Master Destiny. As soon as Saul had finished reading it, the diary flipped to the next page. The second page was the golden one Saul had just obtained. Staring at the sheet, which gleamed with a metallic luster yet appeared soft and delicate, Saul couldn't resist the urge to reach out and touch it. To his disappointment, he still couldn't make contact with the diary. And the golden page didn't react to him at all, unlike the black pages, which would actively appear and explain their use. It was as if the golden page hadn't truly acknowledged Saul yet. Saul tried several other methods, but the golden page remained unresponsive. Looks like using the golden page requires certain conditions, but I don't know whether they're environmental or internal. With no progress made, Saul had no choice but to set the diary aside. The golden page likely had something to do with Kismet. It was best to be cautious for now. Well then, let's begin the Soul Resin 2 modification. But first, I need to study the theory behind the Fleshcraft spell. Saul took out the blood-red magic crystal he'd gotten from Butler Hunter and infused it with his mental energy. This time, he encountered no resistance and was able to read its contents freely. Inside was not only the full inheritance of Fleshcraft, but also Ralph's research notes on the dead wizard's diary. Each scroll contained over 100,000 words. Saul would need to sift through them carefully to avoid being led astray by mistakes of the past. After just a quick glance, he clicked his tongue and sighed. No idea how long I'll be stuck in forced seclusion this time. While Saul was following the Tower Master's instructions and hiding in the warehouse to fix his body, a new and terrifying rumor began spreading among the servants and butlers. George, who had already made a name for himself among the male servants, was carefully leading his younger brother David through the 6th floor of the West Tower, an area reserved for first-rank apprentices and the location of Saul's former dormitory. Servants lived on floors 2 through 4 of the West Tower. Butlers lived on the 5th floor. First-rank apprentices lived on floors 6 through 10. And second-rank apprentices on floors 11 through 13. According to the tower's rules, it was forbidden for servants to enter the floors for apprentices without permission. If anyone pursued the matter, George could be severely punished. But he had no choice. Other than Saul, he didn't know who else to turn to. Who else would be willing to help? George had regretted it countless times. Why had he tried to act so impressively in his letters home, leading his family to actually believe he held status in the tower? Because of that, they had even sent his 9-year-old brother to join him. When David arrived, he still naively thought that working hard for a couple of years might lead to becoming a wizard apprentice. Now, not even a month had passed, and David was about to get swept up in a terrifying incident. Recently, there had been 2 missing persons cases among the servants. Unlike previous abnormal deaths, this time there were no bodies, no causes of death. If the butlers hadn't conducted a routine head count, no one would have even noticed anyone was gone. And 2 days after the first person vanished, another servant disappeared. In the past, when abnormal deaths occurred, the tower would dispatch apprentices with the appropriate level of strength to handle it. But this time there was no body, no evidence. No one knew whether they were dead, had run away, or been devoured by something. As a result, no apprentices were interested in taking the task. No takers meant the disappearances were likely to continue. And tonight, David had come to George saying he'd been assigned to clean the corridor on the floor for second-rank apprentices. George's mind instantly flashed back to 2 years ago. He remembered how back then, many servants had died in a short span of time. New recruits couldn't even keep up with the death rate, leading to a severe labor shortage. Things didn't start to calm down until Saul became a wizard apprentice, and the death rate among the servants gradually slowed. That brought on a long period of peace. But even so, only 5 boys from George's old dorm, where he once shared a bedroll with Saul, were still alive. Those memories flooded back, and a deep unease settled over George. He felt certain these 2 disappearances were only the beginning. Chapter 211, The Basement. He first braced himself and went a look for the steward, hoping he could change his younger brother's assigned task. But he couldn't find the steward. The steward seemed to be everywhere. You could spot his busy figure at any given time of day. Yet when you actually needed him, you'd find that he was nowhere to be found, no matter how hard you searched. Some people had privately discussed this, saying that the steward's mysteriousness was second only to the master of the Wizard Tower. This time, George didn't manage to find the steward before night fell. As it neared 8 o'clock, the time they absolutely had to return, George gritted his teeth and decided to go seek out Saul, who had once shared the same dorm bunk with him, but was now already a wizard apprentice. However, when he followed his memory to the dorm where Saul had lived after becoming a first-rank apprentice, he discovered that the place had already turned into an empty room. "Brother," David asked timidly behind him, "do you really know that wizard apprentice, sir?" The little boy looked around uneasily. To him, all the wizard apprentices who occasionally passed by looked terrifying. He would rather clean the corridors at night than stay here any longer. David tugged at George's sleeve. "Brother, let's go." George was also deeply disappointed at that moment. Back when he had still been ignorant, when Saul had just become an apprentice, he had volunteered to become Saul's personal servant. However, the steward had reminded him that someone of the lowest status, with no ability whatsoever, had no right to apply to be a personal servant, unless Saul personally requested it. But the steward also advised George not to waste that bit of past connection on something so meaningless. So George had clung to that rare connection, carefully maintaining it, doing his best to show a closeness different from others whenever he had the fortune to see Saul. Yet he hadn't expected that, when he truly needed to use that favor, he wouldn't even be able to find the person. George gripped his younger brother tightly, standing dazed in place, and for the first time clearly realized the bond he had relied on was, in fact, nothing. Maybe the 2 years of preferential treatment he'd received from the steward, on account of having once shared a bunk with Saul, had already used up all the value of that connection. And the now ever-rising Saul had already become someone far beyond his reach. "Brother," David noticed that something was off with his brother's state and nervously shook his arm. George finally came back to his senses and tried to make himself look calm. "It's fine," George repeated. "It's fine. Tonight your brother will go with you." David was instantly reassured. In his eyes, his brother was an impressive figure. "Okay, brother." The little boy leapt onto George's back, and just like when they were little, pressed his forehead against the back of George's head. George let his little brother fool around, but the smile on his face looked more like he was about to cry. Still, he didn't let David see his fear. "It might not necessarily go wrong," he murmured silently in his heart. Well, finally, a breakthrough. After several days of intense study and sorting, Saul had finally figured out the principles of flesh crafting. It was a type of magic that granted one's flesh extreme vitality and enhanced physical abilities through constant devouring. It included many branching spells, used to maintain the purity of one's bloodline, preserve the clarity of the soul, and various corresponding body modifications. Together, these formed the entire inheritance of flesh crafting. Fortunately, Saul didn't need to master everything. He only had to extract what was relevant and helpful to his soul resin-based body refinement. And given that the Bloodthorn family was a small-scale wizard family, The knowledge they researched generally wouldn't be too dangerous. Small families couldn't afford to lose too many members after all. That's why even as a second-rank apprentice, Saul could study spells that were normally for true wizards. Aside from researching flesh crafting, Saul also took time to read all the Bloodthorn family's records related to the dead wizard's diary, along with Ralph's series of hypotheses and experiments surrounding it. Unfortunately, most of it wasn't as useful as Saul had hoped. Well, of course, if the Bloodthorns had truly grasped the diary's secrets, they'd never have let it fall into my hands. Saul lay on the single bed in the second storeroom, hands behind his head, eyes gazing up at the shadowy ceiling above. It says in the diary that it came from the Bloodrose family, which seems to have perished during the Hanging Hand Valley War, but there might still be descendants alive. If I ever get the chance, I should go investigate. Saul glanced toward the diary resting on his left shoulder and sighed. Dear diary, if only you were a little more proactive, I wouldn't have to work so hard to uncover your origin. But the diary remained silent, its usual cold aloofness undisturbed. Forget it, my head's spinning from all the reading. No meditation tonight, just a proper sleep to recover my magic. Saul relaxed and closed his eyes, a rare peaceful smile playing on his lips at the thought of restful sleep. But this slumber turned out far from pleasant. Saul was jolted awake by a searing heat, like a brand against his skin. When he came to, he realized with horror, he wasn't in the second storeroom anymore. Even worse, he was in an out-of-body state. What is this place? How did I end up here? When he first woke up, Saul was still floating mid-air. As his mind caught up, he fell to the ground due to sheer mental inertia. Luckily, he had experienced several out-of-body episodes before, so he quickly calmed himself. He began to cautiously observe his surroundings. He now stood in a spacious room, the ceiling rising to at least 5 meters, higher than any floor he'd seen in the Wizard Tower. His gaze dropped to the floor, where he saw 3 giants sleeping in a corner, huddled together. Each of them looked to be over 2 meters tall, with muscular frames and arms twice the size of Saul's thighs. But compared to their hulking bodies, their heads were disproportionately small, giving them an odd and unbalanced appearance. Just then, a door at the far end of the room opened, and 2 more giants walked in. Saul recognized one of them. He was the burly man who always curled up at the end of the hallway near the corpse room on East Tower's 2nd floor. The other one he didn't know, but guessed he was also a servant of the Wizard Tower. These mutant servants handled the lowest level, most dangerous work, tasks regular people never encountered. Seeing someone familiar, Saul felt a bit more at ease. No matter what, he was still inside the Wizard Tower. What is this place? He walked over and saw the 2 giants pushing a cart toward a large machine. Saul floated up for a better look. The machine resembled both a meat grinder and one of those crushers for industrial waste. One of the giants pulled a large box out of the cart. Saul recognized it immediately. It was the same kind of container used to store unusable materials when he worked in the corpse room. So this is the place where they process trash or contaminated materials. Must it be the basement of the Wizard Tower? If that was the case, then the 1st floor of the East Tower should be directly above his head. Did I really just drift out of my body in my sleep and float straight down to the basement? Saul thought, half amused, half exasperated. Just then, one of the giants dumped the contents of the box into the meat grinder, while the other walked up to the front and, muscles bulging, began turning a large crank. The handle spun, engaging the gears inside. The uppermost blades of the meat grinder began to rotate. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The first giant poured everything from the box in. Bones and meat scraps clashed with spinning blades, producing sounds that were sometimes crisp, sometimes sickeningly squelchy. Once the first load was ground down, the giant replaced it with a second box and began pouring again. Saul decided not to keep watching. He looked up toward the ceiling, wondering if he should try floating back up the way he came and return to the East Tower's first floor. But just then, the rumbling meat grinder suddenly stopped. Saul looked down and was startled to see something round rolling atop the grinder's blades. It was a human head, its outer flesh shredded into an unrecognizable mess of blood and gore. Chapter 212, The Interlayer Eye. The giant turning the machine looked up slowly and said, "You forgot to pull the head out." The other giant, puzzled, set down the large box. "Strange, I thought I did." He reached in and pulled out the head, holding it in both hands. "Oh, here it is. I'll put it away." The giant at the machine suddenly licked his lips, eyes locked onto the human head with an intense hunger. But in the end, he said nothing, just nodded and resumed cranking the machine. The machine continued its operation without the head, grinding the remaining contents into pulp. Curious about what the giants would do with the head, Saul followed them. But just as he approached, a semi-transparent, crying face suddenly burst from the head in the giant's hands. It wailed silently as it flew straight at Saul. He dodged to the left, but the face twisted midair with eerie agility, opening its mouth to bite him. Saul instinctively raised his arm to block it. He couldn't release any magic at the moment, so he could only rely on his mental body to endure it. The face bit into his arm with a sickening crunch, sending a wave of surreal, soul-piercing pain through his mind. Gritting his teeth, Saul grabbed the face clamped on his fingers and tore it off. Then, he yanked with both hands in opposite directions. The face emitted a haunting, wailing cry, pitiful beyond words. But Saul was unmoved. He pulled again, tearing it cleanly in half. Then he stacked the two halves and kept pulling. Only when he'd shredded the face into a dozen pieces did he stop, still shaken. By then it was utterly silent. He let go, and the pieces dispersed into wisps of greenish smoke. That was close. Saul lowered his hands, wiping his face as if brushing away cold sweat that wasn't there. "Leaving your body really invites trouble. I should head back quickly." He glanced down and noticed the ring finger on his right hand was shorter. It was probably bitten off and swallowed by the face. But it was too late for him to get it back. The ghostly face had already turned to smoke. His finger likely vanished along with it. At the same time, the head in the giant's hands suddenly shattered into more than a dozen pieces, so broken it could never be put back together. Red and white fluid oozed from the fragments, seeping through the giant's fingers. It broke. The giant stood dumbly in place. The other giant abandoned the machine controls and rushed over with a loud clatter. "It's broken. Good. We can eat it." He didn't wait for a reply. He just buried his face in the giant's palms and started noisily devouring the fragments. The other giant snapped out of his daze, quickly pulling his hand back and leaning in to eat as well. The two giants fought over the shattered head, nearly coming to blows. Saul looked away in disgust. Are these giants cannibals? But they didn't react to the other body parts, maybe they're brain eaters. He glanced at his right hand with a pang of regret. I wonder if this'll have any side effects. Better get back fast. He looked up and started walking toward the ceiling, intending to pass through the upper floor directly. As before, he stepped upward as if walking on stairs, until his head slowly submerged into the ceiling. But as he emerged on the next floor, he realized he wasn't in the first level of the East Tower. He was inside a pitch-black interlayer. His head had passed through something like a thin film, and now he was face to face with countless eyes. The eyes were packed tightly together, pupil slits as fine as needle tips. The moment Saul's head popped through, all those pupils shifted at once, staring straight at him. Saul's scalp tingled. This, Isn't this that strange space the Tower Master took me through 10 days ago when we entered the second floor of the East Tower? Was that room just now not a basement? He couldn't determine his location, so he braced himself and continued moving upward under the weight of all those stairs. But as soon as his full body entered the space, an intense heat engulfed him, like being drenched in boiling oil. The diary flew out in front of him in sync with the pain. June 12, lunar calendar of the year 316. You've developed a bad habit of sleepwalking, falling from the sky to the depths below. The first fall caught those creatures off guard, and you narrowly escaped. But now that you've shown up again, steaming hot and delicious, they've made up their minds. Even if it enjars the Tower Master, they'll enjoy this meal delivered straight to their mouths. Take a look down. Is your body bubbling? That's the tempting sight of a pot of rich, creamy clam chowder coming to a boil. The moment Saul saw the diary appear, he was ready to flee. But after reading the entry, he turned and bolted. Now he truly understood what it meant to run like your pants are on fire. In the face of mortal danger, he finally grasped instinctively how to float like a ghost. With a swift swoosh, he shot back down below. When he returned to the basement, his entire body was still trembling. Not from fear, but from the heat. He could almost see steam rising off his skin. If I'd stayed in there even a moment longer, I really might have boiled alive. It took a long while before Saul finally calmed down. Looking at the doorway the giants had used, he decided it was better to return via the normal path. The East Tower was clearly far more dangerous than the West Tower. He'd nearly died just from walking through a wall. He passed through the door of the giant's room without resistance and carefully peeked at the corridor outside. It was the typical sloped ramp found throughout both towers, gently inclined with just enough friction to walk steadily. He ascended along the ramp and before long reached the end of the path. There was a wall. I didn't see any other exits along the way. The giants must have come through here. Is there some hidden mechanism? Saul wondered as he continued forward. In any case, physical barriers no longer stopped him. Still, he remained cautious while passing through walls. He didn't want to end up in that eyeball space again. This time, he successfully phased through the wall and entered a dim hallway. There were candles here too, but their light was faint and didn't reach every corner, leaving scattered pools of glow. Here, Saul knew exactly where he was. This was the shadowy corridor connecting the second and first floors of the East Tower, the one that distorted your sense of direction. Finally back, who knew sleeping could lead to an out-of-body experience. Maybe I really should order a coffin that can trap my soul. Though his body still ached from the burns, Saul could tell his mental form was stable. With some potions and rest, he'd recover quickly. He began to relax. This, too, was thanks to his exceptional mental aptitude. If someone with weaker mental strength had gone through that, they'd probably be insane by now. Saul turned right and soon arrived at the first bronze door leading to the storeroom. But I don't have a body. How am I supposed to push the door open? He muttered. Before he could figure it out, the bronze doors suddenly opened a crack. Someone coming out. But before he could celebrate, he noticed something shocking. The doors were opening together. When both bronze doors opened at once, you had to immediately freeze in place until they shut again. Despite his shock, Saul stood stock still, just as Mentor Kaz had warned him. Thin, noodle-like white arms extended from inside, groping blindly through the air, across the floor, and along the walls searching for something. Chapter 213, The Interlayer 2. Saul didn't dare move, but his eyes never left the slender, noodle-like arms in front of him. The fingers on those arms writhed gently, as if out of excitement or perhaps spasms. Gradually, they reached him. Saul tensed immediately. because these arms were actually touching his soul form, stroking repeatedly along his legs, his hands, his face. Saul wasn't surprised they could make contact. Judging by how they appeared, these weren't normal monsters at all. They resembled wraiths composed of soul essence. These were the same arms that had dragged in the third-rank apprentice Ferguson. Their power was terrifying, easily comparable to a true wizard. Saul was now in soul form, with no magic or spells to rely on. His earlier burst of mental strength that tore apart the crying face might not even be enough to cut through these noodles. His plan was to wait for the arms to retreat, then find a way into the storeroom. But the grotesque limbs only grew more enthusiastic in their groping, beginning to wrap around him, unwilling to let go. Even the ones that had initially missed their target were now seeking him out, one by one, binding him up like a mummy. And as time passed, a chilling numbness began to creep across his surface, slowly seeping into his bones and organs. Luckily, he was currently a soul with no real skin or bones. Otherwise, his body might have already suffered severe damage, making it impossible to stay still. Saul grit his teeth and endured, waiting for the arms to retreat, for the door to close. But what he got instead was the diary flying up in front of his face. The hardcover book opened with a flutter of pages and revealed a fresh entry. June 12th, year 316 of the lunar calendar. You who won't sleep properly have met those just as restless. At first, they merely probed with caution. But greed gradually triumphed over reason, or perhaps reason never existed at all. They pull at you, eagerly inviting you to join the midnight revelry. After tonight, may your corpse, what remains of you in this world, be discovered before it rots. Saul's eyes flew wide. The diary's words alerted him to something he hadn't noticed. The arms groping his body had started pulling, gently testing, tugging him toward the door. Greed has overtaken reason. They're trying to pull me in despite the rules. Having long grown used to the diary's cryptic phrasing, Saul instantly extracted the real warning hidden within. He no longer cared about the rules his mentor had laid down. He began to struggle immediately. He clawed and tore at the arms and fingers entwining him. If they wouldn't let go, he'd rip them off. Sure enough, these arms hadn't yet fully committed to dragging him in. His resistance freed most of his body almost at once. Still disentangling himself, Saul turned and fled. But the moment he tried to escape, he triggered the remaining hesitant arms. Greed surged past their fear. The arms swelled, thickening rapidly, fingers becoming strong and sinewy. The hallway was suddenly packed with white limbs, their skin pressing and scraping together with slick, gritty sounds. One arm still lying across Saul's face ballooned in an instant, twisted fingers locking down on his face and blocking his sight, trying to keep him there. Saul drifted forward, tearing at the fingers gripping his face. But the thing had a strong hold. While it couldn't completely stop him, it still clung to him tenaciously. His pace slowed as a result. Saul couldn't afford to be cautious anymore. He used both hands, even his teeth, biting down hard on the fingers wrapped around his face. He thought he heard a faint scream. The hand across his face recoiled instantly, snapping back like a rubber band and vanishing into the mass of limbs. Saul finally accelerated again. But the horrible scraping sounds behind him were getting closer. When he glanced back, a few fingers were already reaching for his back. The diary still hovered before his chest. He hadn't yet escaped death. Grinding his teeth, Saul pushed to run faster. Suddenly, he heard a crunch from his mouth. He realized he'd bitten off a chunk of flesh from that arm. Play, he spat it out immediately, unsure what he'd just chewed. While running, he roared at the arms gaining on him. Come any closer and I'll bite you all to death. Amazingly, the threat actually had some effect. The nearest arm hesitated, freezing in place. But that was all. The others continued surging after him in a mad frenzy, stretching toward the fleeing soul. Another finger caught his ankle, nearly toppling him. This won't work, Saul adjusted his balance quickly. Without magic, I can't cast spells. If I'm forced to stop and fight hand-to-hand, I'll eventually be overwhelmed. As a wizard apprentice, his mental strength was weak, lacking proper attack methods. The only time he'd ever used it to fight was through Byron's consciousness platform. And throwing bricks by hand. I can't stop. If I stop, they'll drag me back. I remember that even soul forms have methods of attack, but apprentices rarely learn them. Victor's image came to mind, how he used his harp to control people's thoughts. Victor didn't release a single hint of magic. That's why no one noticed what he was doing. It let him control others in secret. After all, a wary mind and a relaxed one are completely different targets. Even a second-rank wizard would struggle to control that many minds at once. That would contradict what Saul had learned in the Wizard Tower's foundational courses. The hands were nearly upon him again. Saul felt their icy presence brushing against his back. Gotta take a gamble. With no further messages from the diary, Saul made up his mind and began to activate his mental strength. This time he had no magic to guide a spell, but Saul didn't stop. He drove his mental power like magic. As it circulated, he felt himself twist like a vortex, reshaping with each pulse of energy. It left his consciousness fuzzy, hard to maintain, but whenever he started to lose focus, he looked down at the diary and instantly snapped back to clarity. Finally, a simple spell model took form within his soul body, channeling pure mental force. Now, Saul's head snapped around a full 180 degrees, just like a true wraith, eyes wide as he stared down the oncoming arms. Zero-tier spell, demoralized gaze. Whoosh! It was like someone hit pause. Every single warped arm froze, stuck in place. Saul didn't stick around to admire the chaos he'd unleashed. He whipped his head back around and kept running. His choice had been correct, because 3 seconds later, the frozen arms exploded into a frenzy again, growing wildly in rage. His mental energy had been heavily drained. He wasn't sure he could pull off another attack. Then suddenly, he burst into a brightly lit area. The pale, pursuing arms instantly began to smoke, like they'd touched hot metal, recoiling with agonized spasms. At the same moment, the diary finally snapped shut and drifted serenely back to his left shoulder. Saul nearly collapsed, his whole soul body on the verge of exhaustion. He slowly sank to the ground and murmured to himself, "I'm alive." Chapter 214, The Interlayer 3. To Saul's left was the eerily familiar crimson door to the corpse room. And in front of that door were 2 more identical ones, which meant Saul had arrived at the 2nd floor of the East Tower. What the hell has Tower Master Gorsa been raising in the Wizard Tower? Saul dared only to grumble in his heart. Once I get stronger, I'm going to tie every last one of those arms and fingers into a dead knot. After venting his anxiety and gloom a little, Saul was once again hit with a headache. Flinging mental energy like magic really hurts. He dashed past the 3 corpse rooms and only stopped when he reached the sloped path at the end. But then he noticed something unusual, hitting the brakes just in time to stop at the corner between the corridor and the slope. From up ahead came faint whispers of human voices. "So hungry, so hungry." Saul frowned, a wave of bad premonition welling up in his heart. No way, not again. Is there no safe place in the East Tower at night? So hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry. The voice suddenly grew louder, and from more and more directions came desperate cries of hunger. The ravenous howls seemed to come from all around, Yet no matter how Saul looked directly or peered through his semi-immersive meditation, not a single figure was in sight. Finally, out of the corner of his eye, Saul spotted something white trickling down the wall. He turned to look more closely, and saw it was wax dripping from a candle sconce. He had once guessed that each candle in the wizard tower was connected to a hidden pipeline. When working normally, the candles would burn continuously, 24/7, thanks to the wax being constantly supplied through these pipes. Only broken sconces had dry pipelines. These pipelines seemed neglected, but in truth, they were meticulously managed. Which candle needed refilling and which didn't was perfectly orchestrated. Never once had there been a malfunction all these years. And yet now, after Saul's soul accidentally left the vault, he encountered this anomaly of wax flowing from inside the walls. And not just in one place. To his shock, Saul found that all the walls around him, front, back, and sides, and every candle base were oozing warm, uncoagulated wax. Worse, as the wax spread across the walls, the voices crying out in hunger grew even louder, surrounding Saul from every direction. So hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry. Seeing this, Saul knew he was in deep trouble again. He tried to retreat back to the second floor of the east tower, only to find that the wax spilling from behind was now covering the entire floor and walls. On the slope ahead, the wax defied gravity and flowed up to the ceiling before trickling down in a shimmering curtain of waxen rain, completely sealing off Saul's escape. Is this wax dangerous? Saul glanced at the diary. No warning. Still, he felt uneasy. He knew a bit about the composition of this wax. The candles were originally meant to soothe Saul, but the wax before him was clearly abnormal. So hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry, so hungry. As wax consumed the walls, floors, and ceilings, the sounds in the corridor only grew more deafening. I can't let that stuff touch me, Saul thought resolutely. But the wax rain was already falling in front of him, and the wax behind was piling up fast, about to surround him. Left with no choice, Saul turned his gaze back to the first floor of the East Tower, where he just escaped from. Those noodles probably can't survive long outside. If I head back now, maybe I can use the dark corridor to avoid this out-of-control wax. The diary didn't stop him, which meant those arms were probably gone. The plan was feasible. Saul lifted off the ground. The longer he was separated from his body, the more comfortable he became in his ghostly state. If not for the danger of staying out too long and becoming a real ghost, Saul might have enjoyed playing the wandering night phantom. Just as the wax behind him began creeping up the ceiling, sealing off the last root, Saul quickly floated up, weaving through the encroaching wax. But just as he was about to escape, the candle sconces on either side suddenly burst open, spraying wax like shower heads, drenching Saul before he could react. The moment he was soaked, his airborne body suddenly felt leaden. With a heavy thud, he crashed to the floor and landed squarely in the thick layer of wax. If a third party had seen Saul at that moment, they might have been dumbstruck. Because the instant Saul fell into the wax, his soul melted and merged with it. From above, one could see a flat, two-dimensional Saul within the wax. Eat him, eat him, eat him. The hungry whispers turned to greedy desire. The white wax, carrying the drifting soul, began to retract back into the wall pipes. Everything returned almost to normal, clean, dim, tidy, silent. Only near the shadowy corridor, two candle sconces had somehow fallen to the ground and now lay there, rolling in loneliness. As for Saul, the moment he was drenched, he knew things were bad. The only small relief was that the diary still hadn't reacted. Now a two-dimensional being, Saul was dragged along by the wax, twisted and compressed until he was squeezed into the pipes. As the light faded, the owners of the voices pounced on him from within the narrow pipeline. Saul couldn't see them, but he could hear them and feel them. Countless mouths bit into his soul. The sounds of tearing and devouring came from all around, inside him and out. They're going to eat me. Even though the diary hadn't signaled death yet, Saul began struggling in panic, especially when he felt one of his eyes get torn from its socket and chewed away. He instinctively reached with his right hand to grab it back. Though his soul had already been distorted, and that eye may not have been a real eye anymore, Saul instinctively knew it was something important. But there were too many enemies. Even if he wanted to use mental energy to cast spells again, he couldn't. It hurt too much. Every inch of him was being gnawed on by countless mouths, like a dying beast tossed into a lake of piranhas. Worse, he felt his right hand get torn off. At that moment, the last nerve in his mind finally snapped. Hungry, 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 that's all you know, hunger, Saul roared from the depths of his soul, ignoring the pain around him. Well, I haven't eaten either, damn it. He completely disregarded the mouths, the pain, and even the possibility of dying here. Opening his mouth wide, Saul bit into the shapeless, nameless enemy before him. Ever since he'd bitten off a chunk of the noodle arm, he'd vaguely realized, if other monsters could devour him, maybe he could devour them too. Limited by his current awareness, the only way he could do it was with his mouth. Saul no longer cared if the diary warned him or if this would lead to other problems. At this point, his mindset was simple. When you owe too many debts, what's one more? He bit down on one of the mouths and, burning with rage, chased after the one that had taken his eye and hand. Along the way, anyone who bit him, he bit back. If he couldn't reach them, he ignored them and just ate whatever was in front. Gradually, fewer mouths dared appear in front of him, and his speed picked up. Even in the narrow pipe, Saul was practically sprinting like a sprinter in a 100-meter dash. Through his spiritual perception, he could feel the thief that stole his eye and hand still ahead. As nothing dared attack him anymore, nothing dared block him either, Saul finally caught the culprit, and without bothering to tell which parts were enemy or his own, he devoured it all in one furious gulp with his now deformed mouth. Saul, ever since I stopped being human. Chapter 215, Changing Faces. Just as Saul finished devouring his most hated enemy, a sudden gust of wind blew from behind him, forcefully spitting him out through an exit. Splat! The moment he hit the ground, Saul collapsed like melted wax, spreading out in a puddle. His body twitched slightly. Then from that new form, his features and limbs slowly began to take shape. Finally, he opened his eyes and reached up to touch them. His eyes were still there, so were his hands. Sure enough, anything lost in soul form could just be eaten back. At that moment, a door behind him to the right suddenly opened. A half-face peeked out from beyond it. Only one eye, half a nose, and part of a mouth were visible. The proportions of the face were terribly off. Tiny eye, oversized nose, a reasonably normal mouth. But when it spoke, it revealed jagged, mismatched teeth. Oh, let me see, who's the lucky soul that escaped this time? No wonder the trash can turn red again. Saul recognized that half-face immediately. This was Kaz's laboratory. He hadn't fully recovered yet. Some of the remaining fluid on the floor was still flowing back into his body. Tusk, the half-face hanging on the door spoke again. This batch of rookies is terrible. Still haven't settled on a new form after all this time. Want me to help you out? At that moment, the final bit of liquid slipped back into Saul's body, forming his boots. Yes, even after nearly breaking apart in confusion, Saul reformed his body and still dressed himself. Even in soul form, he didn't like running around naked inside a wizard tower full of familiar faces. However, while Saul maintained a wizard's elegance, he failed to realize he wasn't fully recovered. At the very least, something was wrong with his mind, but he hadn't noticed. He swayed as he turned to face the door, clutching his stomach with his right hand. He stared at the annoying face on the door and said, "Then help me, I'm starving." The half-face widened its one eye and its mouth twitched uncontrollably. Don't come any closer. Sorry, I take it back." It recognized Saul. It had once gleefully watched a new apprentice, about to be consumed by the lab's evil spirits. But that night the tower master, who never entered the lab, suddenly barged in and took Saul away. The other evil spirits thought Saul had just gotten lucky, saved at the last moment. But the half-face nailed to the door had a different suspicion. Had the tower master been standing outside the door all along, enjoying the show? The lucky boy had passed the test and soared ever since. Since then, the half-face never dared show itself again, just in case Saul remembered and reported it to the master. But who would have guessed that halfway through his meteoric rise, that same apprentice would become evil spirit himself and crawl out of the blood-red trash bin? This time, the half-face had run into a real problem. Saul had someone to save him, it didn't. Misunderstanding the situation entirely, the half-face began apologizing and demeaning itself. I don't taste good. I'm not picky. I'm here under Kaz's orders, just guarding the door. It's fine, I can replace the door for him. Saul kept walking toward it, eyes locked, licking his lips hungrily. Back in the pipes, he devoured numerous strange spirits and monsters. Now, stepping out, he was hit with a brutal hunger. Seeing monsters again, he didn't feel fear, just cravings. He wanted more. The half-face trembled. After years of being the one to scare others, it was finally getting a taste of real fear. It didn't dare retreat. If the door was destroyed, it had zero defenses. As Saul crept closer, the half-face's one eye rolled. Suddenly, it retreated and popped back out, with a new look. Its features had transformed into Angela's face. "Big brother Saul," it said in Angela's soft voice, mimicking her sweet tone, "please don't hurt Angela. Angela's a good girl, I can help you with lots of things, Tilda." Not only did it nail the voice, but the expression too. It was nearly identical to Angela herself peeking from behind the door with dewy eyes. If Saul had been even slightly more lucid, he might have spared it, if only because of its usefulness or because he knew the others in the lab. But now, seeing Angela's pale, tender face, Saul only felt hungrier. The poor half-face had no idea. Thinking it understood human emotions, it assumed Saul's lack of reaction meant he wasn't interested in 14-year-old girls. It vanished again, then popped out with a new look, a woman Saul didn't recognize. She was beautiful, very beautiful and sexy. This face looked to be in her early 20s, maybe younger. Slightly upturned eyes, plump red lips, she radiated a mature allure that could entrance most men. The woman gently parted her lips. "Junior, wanna play a game with your senior?" That voice. That was Concha's face. Not the one in the glass jar, but the one that perfectly matched what Saul had imagined. By now, Saul had reached the door. He raised a hand toward the half-face. Hearing that sultry voice and seeing that face, he paused for just a moment, but the hunger still gnawed at him. Two conflicting desires clashed in his mind. His hand slowed but continued to open, fingers stretching toward the half-face. The half-face stared at Saul's hand, its lone pupil trembling. "You don't like this one either." It vanished again. When it returned, it wore a new face, Mark's. The very next second, Saul, who had slowed, suddenly lunged, grabbed the half-face, and tore it off the door in one swift motion, shredding it into pieces and stuffing it into his mouth. Even in his dazed state, the moment he saw Mark's face, Saul could barely keep from swearing. As he finished chewing, a new thought formed in his mind. "This is too slow, how can I eat faster?" Images flashed through his mind, finally settling on a creature covered in enormous black tentacles. "If only I could eat like the soul-devouring Meyer, each tentacle a mouth. He slowly lowered his gaze to his own clumsy body and limbs, and a wide grin spread across his face. Under his gaze, everything below his neck began to melt again into his earlier buttery form. Then it started changing. From the yellow goo sprouted dozens of semi-transparent, octopus-like tentacles. His entire lower body transformed into a massive octopus with thick, powerful limbs. The only part that still resembled Saul was the human head at the top. Each tentacle had suction cups that could open into mouths ringed with sharp teeth, and the tips could split into shark-like jaws. From those mouths, small tongues flicked out, trembling in the air like they were sniffing for food. In this form, Saul was extremely pleased, but also hungrier. The sensory organs on his tentacle tips told him there were still more snacks in this room. He turned his head and saw the locked cabinets lining the wall, and a delighted grin appeared on his face. But before he could act, the laboratory door suddenly creaked open again. A black shadow silently entered, pushing a janitor's cart. But instead of trash, there were two boys in the cart. One big, one small. Their chests were faintly rising and falling, still alive. Once inside, the shadow closed the door with a kick. Then, like water flowing away, the darkness receded, revealing Angela's expressionless face. Chapter 216, Octopus Saul. Saul looked at this version of Angela, stern, poised, and suddenly, the gnawing hunger in his stomach didn't feel so urgent anymore. Perhaps seeing a familiar, truly real person had helped him pull his mind back from the brink. Even so, the newly evolved tentacles around Angela didn't retreat. His tongue flicked out a few times, nearly brushing against her face. Right then, Angela abruptly turned and walked deeper into the laboratory. Saul quickly retracted his tentacles to avoid touching her and raising suspicion. Unaware that a bizarre aura was lingering around her, Angela walked briskly toward the back cabinet. As soon as she opened the cabinet door, a chorus of desperate cries echoed out, "Help me." This was the cabinet used to store the puppets for mental aptitude testing. The puppets were still more or less neatly lined up inside, but as the cries grew louder, their small wooden bodies began to tremble. They shivered faintly and gradually started inching toward the front. Angela's left hand suddenly lifted and waved at the puppets inside, then quickly grabbed one. But as soon as she pulled one out, the remaining puppets grew even more restless. They trembled violently, as if about to tumble out of the cabinet at any moment. The noise drew Saul's attention. He raised his tentacles, mouths opening one after another, aimed toward the puppets in the cabinet. These little things look pretty tasty too, Saul thought, hunger flaring up once more. Just as Angela frowned and was about to shut the cabinet, she suddenly noticed something. Total silence. The puppets stopped crying for help and ceased their shaking. She looked at her left hand. If you could shut them up, why didn't you do it earlier? After a pause, she frowned and muttered, "What, it was you." Angela slammed the cabinet door shut and spun around, eyes scanning the room. Her voice rang out sharp and commanding, "Show yourself." Saul froze. Did she just spot me? Should I just eat her now? But before Saul's battle between logic and hunger reached a conclusion, the door to Kaz's lab swung open once more. A man stepped in, bearing a 7/10 resemblance to the late Bill, who had died in Hanging Hand Valley. Unlike Bill's ever-mocking expression, this man was deadpan, with a cold, shadowy air. He stepped in, shut the door behind him, locked it, and stared icily at the visibly tense Angela. "Caught you this time, follower of bitch, eh?" Angela's eyes went wide. "Billy." But before she could react, her left hand acted first. It shot forward, 5 fingers unleashing a twisted gray energy. Billy, however, merely opened his mouth and muttered something under his breath. The approaching energy fizzled with a sickening sizzle and dissolved completely. Angela's tension skyrocketed. Her left hand threw the puppet it held. Billy caught it barehanded. With a sharp squeeze, the puppet wailed in agony, and its hollow eyes wept two streams of blood. He tossed the now broken puppet into the yellow garbage bin near the door. Then slowly, he advanced toward Angela. Angela looked more anxious than ever, though her eyes were darting rapidly, clearly seeking a way to escape. When Billy was within 3 meters of her, he halted. "You've been harboring a wraith in your body. Apprentices these days are gutsy. I've seen this method before, but executed far more skillfully. Don't tell me you bought a defective version from the Mutual Aid Society." Angela's eyes widened in shock. She froze. "Wait, was it you who sold me that priest's method?" Billy frowned faintly. "Did I word that poorly, or is your hearing just that bad?" "That's not what he said at all." At that moment, a shadow crept across the floor beneath Angela, slinking toward Billy. From the side, Saul noticed a faint dusting of purple motes forming around Billy's body, so subtle they'd be invisible to the naked eye. As Angela's shadow neared those motes, it began to sizzle, burning with an acrid smoke. But Angela couldn't see the motes or the smoke. She only realized something was wrong when the shadow vanished without a trace. Her face paled instantly. Saul, too, grew curious about the purple motes. Curiosity overtook his hunger. He extended a few tentacles toward Billy, one of which stretched out a tongue in an attempt to snag a mote. But the moment it touched a mote, a hole was seared into the tongue tip. The tentacle trembled, quickly withdrawing the burned tongue. This Billy, just like his brother Bill, specializes in poison-based elements. Saul marveled aloud. Then, with a leap, he launched himself to the ceiling. The next instant, Billy turned sharply, scanning the room. The purple motes around him flared outward in a sudden burst, but Saul had already retreated to the ceiling. Billy didn't detect anything unusual. He assumed Angela had made another futile attempt. He withdrew the motes and resumed his approach. Angela, terrified, backed away rapidly. Her spine thudded against the cabinet behind her. She couldn't possibly win a head-on fight against a third-rank apprentice like Billy. But all her secret tactics had failed one after another. Even the illusions conjured by her left hand had vanished the moment they neared Billy, corroded into nothing. Against such a notorious third-rank apprentice, she was powerless. "You plan to hand me over to the instructor?" she asked, helpless now, switching to seduction as a last resort. She looked up at Billy with trembling lashes, a tear sliding down her cheek to her chin. But beauty tricks that might work in the mortal world often fell flat in the wizarding world. And Billy was no exception. He remained utterly unmoved by her tears. "If I'd wanted to catch you, I wouldn't have let you go last time." "Last time?" Angela's voice trembled. "Wait, does that mean it was Billy who let me get away last time when I lured that boy out as a decoy to escape Concha's pursuit?" "That's right. I was watching from not far away when you knocked on that boy's door." Angela couldn't deny it any longer. Her tears dried as she stared at Billy warily. "What exactly do you want?" Billy crossed his arms and leaned against the door. "I need the prayer of Bichai to harvest enough wraiths for crafting a soul toxin." "You're insane. I don't know what a soul toxin is exactly, but to make one powerful enough for a third-rank apprentice, how many people do you think that would take? Even the instructor would rip me apart for that." Billy showed no sign of caring about her outburst. He waited until she finished yelling, then lowered his voice. "Have you been holed up in the wizard tower so long that you've forgotten how vast the world outside is?" Angela was taken aback. Billy continued, "People, there are plenty outside. I'll provide the site, you do the killing. We split the souls 50-50. Angela bit her lip. She'd already killed many, yes. But she'd never considered mass slaughter. Yet Billy spoke of lives like they were just numbers. "Do I even have a choice?" she whispered bitterly, lip trembling. You do, Billy said, lifting his eyes. Death. Chapter 217, Return. Faced with the powerful and domineering Billy, Angela had no room to bargain. She had originally intended to agree verbally, then destroy the evidence once Billy left. That way, at least there'd be no leverage in his hands, giving her some room to maneuver. But the moment she agreed, Billy suddenly moved fast. So fast that even Saul, hanging from the ceiling, didn't react in time. Angela only saw a blur, and the next moment she felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. Something had pierced in through her navel. Startled, she instinctively looked down and pressed her hand to her belly, but found nothing sharp. "What did you do to me?" the girl shrieked, her voice nearly cracking. "No need to panic," Billy said coldly, showing no hint of pity. "I just implanted a toxin inside your body." He stepped back slowly. "If you try anything funny in our future cooperation, I'll turn you into a flower." Billy nodded slightly at Angela. "Clear your lab schedule within 3 days, then come to 1701. With that, he didn't give her a chance to respond and walked out of the lab. Once Billy was gone, Angela trembled all over. She bit down on her lip so hard it bled, but still didn't let up. From the ceiling, a few tentacles silently uncoiled and slowly approached Angela's delicate face. "This is all your fault," Angela said darkly, her expression twisted. Saul hesitated. The tentacles froze midair. "If I die, don't think you'll live either," Angela added, voice full of malice. Suddenly, her left hand swung up and slapped herself hard across the face. Then her expression shifted. The resentful, stunned girl curled her lips into a chilling smile. "Don't forget, I know the prayer technique, and you're the one who's poisoned." Angela's face twisted again, anger now mixed with fear. "Aren't you afraid I'll report you to Mentor Kaz and have you thrown out?" But then she smirked proudly. "Poor little girl, after merging for so long, do you still think you can get rid of me so easily?" Still in control of Angela's body, the Wraith walked to a glass cabinet, swaying her head side to side, admiring the body's beauty. Suddenly, she reached up and grabbed a handful of the soft flesh on her chest. I can't even remember if I was male or female in life, but I'm quite satisfied with this body. Guess I'll reluctantly keep sharing it with you." Angela's face instantly flushed red, but the expression remained one of perverse enjoyment. Saul, watching from the side, saw it all clearly. The Wraith inside Angela was already threatening her soul's dominance. If this continued, the balance between them would collapse. There would be no more sharing, no matter what the Wraith claimed. Still, though Saul had figured it out, he had no intention of interfering. He was interested in the flavor of the Wraith's soul, but peeling her out of the body just seemed like too much trouble. No one knew how much time passed before Angela finally regained control of her body. She quickly released her grip and winced in pain. But that pain was soon replaced by hatred. She turned to the two boys lying on the cart, her expression grim as she approached. With no escape left, she no longer intended to leave anyone else alive. She took out a small golden knife, and without hesitation, stabbed it into the chest of the younger boy. Schlick! The intense pain jolted the boy awake with a blood-curdling scream. The moment he opened his eyes, he saw a beautiful but terrifyingly twisted young woman standing before him. "Why, brother!" The 9-year-old David had no means to resist. His only hope was the brother who always worked cleaning the corridors with him, George. George was also awakened by his little brother's cry. But even with his eyes open, all he could do was watch helplessly as David's heart was cut out. "David!" George's eyes filled with tears instantly. He struggled to get up, but he couldn't move at all, his voice barely more than a faint whisper. "No need to rush," Angela said coldly. "You're next." Dragging the now weakly twitching David, she pulled him onto a bright red circular rug. Angela crouched down, the golden blade reaching for David's skull. Lying flat on the cart, George couldn't see what she was doing, but he could hear it. Ugh, George could only sob, because he heard the sound of flesh being sliced by a sharp blade, the same sound he'd heard when carving beef in the kitchen. Because he heard the scraping of a knife against bone, a sound he'd only heard before while feeding wild beasts. But he had never imagined he'd hear these sounds coming from his little brother. After completing the sacrifice preparation, Angela was drenched in sweat, her face flushed with a disturbing sense of release. She stood up, took out several magic crystals from her pocket, and embedded them around the increasingly crimson rug. The next moment, black markings began to appear across the rug, as if drawn by an invisible hand. Starting from the points where the magic crystals were inserted, the lines extended, twisted, and interlocked, forming a complete spell formation. Saul, who had been watching indifferently the entire time, suddenly narrowed his eyes as he recognized the formation. He'd seen it before, or at least a simplified version of it. His thoughts began to race, his rationality returning. He dropped from the ceiling, octopus tentacles retreating to his sides obediently. If I replace the amplification and condensation runes in this formation, isn't it the same one I found back in Grind Sail Town? Saul slowly approached, watching as a milky white soul emerged from the boy's opened skull. Perhaps due to his young age, even with the formation's enhancement, the soul hadn't fully formed. The boy's head was intact, but his body looked pixelated, unclear, and blurred. Angela frowned. Clearly, the soul didn't meet her standards. She kicked the corpse out of the formation in frustration, then stormed over to the cart and yanked George off. George's face was covered in tears. When Angela dragged him down, he even felt a slight relief. Losing his brother was agonizing, but even worse was waiting, not knowing when his own turn would come. Waiting to die, that was the hardest part. Angela dragged him by the leg, and when he hit the floor, the back of his head slammed against the ground. Already mentally fragile, George passed out immediately. Angela didn't care whether her sacrifice was alive or not. She dragged him across the floor, leaving a trail of blood until they reached the crimson rug. George, Saul finally recognized the boy. It was the only friend, or rather fellow sufferer, he had during his time as a servant. Having spent most of his time hiding in the morgue and storage rooms, Saul had rarely ventured into the public areas used by other servants, so he hadn't seen George in a long time. Memories came flooding back. The panic of arriving in this world, the fury of being bullied, the helplessness before the bloody corridor, the joy of finding the diary, the terror of meeting Kangsha, the excitement of becoming an apprentice, the despair of being besieged by monsters, the satisfaction of killing his enemies. Saul stood on the floor, octopus tentacles retracting into his body. His human limbs returned. Rationality first, then came the emotions. Saul, not insane for now, thanks. Chapter 218, Sit Tight. George, who had just lost his younger brother and fainted from the impact, was dragged into the magic formation by Angela. Angela took out a golden dagger, ready to follow the procedure and extract the heart first. But just as she was about to cut, she froze. George's soul had sat up on its own. His translucent soul floated outside, with his lower body still seated within his physical form. George had no idea what was happening. At first, he sat there dazed. But when he looked up and saw Angela in front of him holding a golden dagger, he nearly leapt in fright. Angela snapped back to her senses, her face lighting up in delight. A free soul, I actually ran into one. George didn't understand what she was talking about. Once he realized he could move, he immediately tried to stand and flee. But as his legs were still partly in his body, he stumbled and fell. As luck would have it, he landed face first onto David's gruesome corpse. David, George froze, then burst into cries of anguish. He reached out to embrace his brother's body, only to find his translucent arms passed right through. It was impossible to touch him. Angela rose slowly to her feet. She had plenty of time and was curious to see what this free soul was capable of. "Woo, woo," George sobbed quietly, only to realize he couldn't even produce tears. He thought he was already dead and gave up on escaping. He simply knelt in despair, trying to hold his brother in a futile embrace. "Brother, brother." But before he could grieve for long, a faint voice came from nearby. George turned in surprise and recoiled in shock. Near his legs was another translucent, white soul. But this one only had a head left, and its features were blurred, looking like it could vanish at any moment. David, hearing that string of brother calls, George finally recognized his younger sibling. He lunged forward, and this time he actually managed to grab David's head. "Brother, it hurts. It really hurts." David seemed unaware of what had happened, only clinging to his brother for help. George clutched him, heartbroken and panicked, but he didn't know what to do to ease his brother's pain. Yet as David's head pressed close to George's soul, his muddled awareness sensed a primal pull. He looked at George's soul neck and felt that if he just had a neck and body of his own, he might feel much better. So suddenly, David leapt out of George's hands and landed on his brother's shoulder. It happened so quickly that neither Angela nor Saul reacted in time. But what came next stunned them even more. David's head began to sway slightly, then attached itself to George's shoulder. George's soul not only didn't reject David's presence, but even tilted his own head to the right to make space for his brother. Just like that, George became a two-headed soul. Saul immediately furrowed his brow, while Angela's eyes widened with ecstatic excitement. A dual soul in one body. No dual consciousness in one soul. I actually encountered a soul even rarer than a free soul. Angela could hardly believe it. After all her relentless bad luck, she had stumbled across an incredibly rare soul for her blessing ritual. If she could harness this soul, then maybe, just maybe, she could finally expel the wraith lurking in her left arm. Angela put down the dagger and flashed a sweet smile, trying to look harmless. Then she straightened up, extended both hands and began to chant. George was still dazed by the sudden appearance of his brother's head on his shoulder. Hearing the melodic voice, he instinctively looked up, along with David. Standing opposite them was a cute little girl with outstretched arms. "Come here, it's too dangerous outside. Come to Big Sister, I'll protect you." George suddenly felt like she was so kind, and that where he stood now was terribly dangerous, as if he could die at any moment. He slowly began to move toward Angela, inching closer. Even one of his feet lifted out of his body and took a step forward. But David wasn't bewitched like George. He only felt that the pretty lady before them was terrifying, just like the demons in horror stories from their village, beautiful faces hiding monsters. "Brother, don't go." But having only just merged into George's body, David lacked any strength and couldn't stop him. He could only watch in panic and helplessness as his brother gradually separated from his body and drifted toward the evil woman. George's soul was nearly completely detached now, with only the thinnest thread still linking him to his body. Angela's eyes gleamed brighter by the second. But then, a hand suddenly reached out from the void and clamped onto George's face, shoving him back into his body with one powerful strike. "Sit tight." Under Saul's gaze, David's head made a quick shhht sound as it retracted back into George's skull. Just moments earlier, Saul had tried stepping out, but Angela and the others couldn't see him. It was like he existed in another space, watching through a screen. Only when he reached out in desperation did one hand finally pierce the veil and enter their world. "Who, damn it, who is it this time?" Angela's pleasant expression twisted in fury. The constant interruptions were enough to make her heart explode with rage. George's soul had been just one step away from fully detaching and becoming hers. But then, out of nowhere, a hand shoved him back. It wasn't just like a duck flying away right before a meal. It was like someone forcefully pried open her throat and yanked the duck out after she'd already swallowed it. Angela glared in the direction the hand had come from, and without hesitation, cast Strike Undead. Whoever was meddling, kill them. Then she could crack open George and harvest his soul. She still had another chance. Just as Saul stood up, he felt a powerful wave of magic surge behind him. He instinctively dove aside, but the black spell light still pierced his left ribs. However, neither of them expected what happened next. Though his body had a small hole, a surge of potent soul energy rushed out and instantly closed the wound. Then Saul felt it again, hunger. It's that thing I just ate. It's replenishing my energy. What the hell was in that candle conduit? Looking back, whatever Saul devoured in his semi-mad state seemed to carry not only intense malice, but also a strange energy. Which was why the zero-tier Strike Undead, a bane to souls, had barely hurt him at all. The injury healed before he could even trade it. Saul turned around, staring at the one hand he'd used to reach through. He could feel how different it was from the rest of his body. Clearly, he stood in this world now. Angela's spell could hurt him after all, but she still couldn't see him. As he studied the peculiarity of that arm, Saul slowly began to grasp its secrets. He dodged 2 more of Angela's attacks and became increasingly sure of his theory. With a ripple like water, his full figure finally appeared before Angela. But just before that, he mimicked the sensation of turning into an octopus and altered his appearance. After all, when his soul left his body, he wasn't exactly wearing Saul's face. Yes, Saul. Seeing his form clearly, Angela's twisted expression turned into blank shock. She clutched her chest with her left hand and instinctively stepped back. I didn't know it was you, she stammered, accidentally slipping into formal speech. Saul glanced at another corpse on the ground. As expected, its head had been processed into a corpse flower, only the limbs remained untouched. So the previous corpse flowers were your handiwork? Saul asked. Angela was about to bite her lip, but then remembered that this man before her had zero interest in beauty. She could only answer honestly, yes. Now that a second person knew, Angela didn't care if there was a third or fourth. As long as the mentor didn't pursue it, the matter remained an open secret. Facing such shameless honesty, Saul was briefly speechless. Dead bodies in the Wizard Tower. Pretty common. Saul himself had done live experiments, so he had no right to play the righteous judge. But still, George is my friend. I'm taking him with me. Chapter 219, George's Opportunity. Angela immediately showed a troubled expression, thinking to herself, take him where? Your own laboratory. She didn't believe for a second that a wizard apprentice wouldn't be interested in a subject like the one with dual consciousness. However, Angela knew she couldn't beat Saul. Moreover, there had been rumors recently that Saul was the student of that person. How could she dare provoke him? All right, Angela's voice was filled with reluctance. The corpse flower doesn't seem to be legitimate magic. Are you sure you want to continue studying it? Angela lowered her head. I've come this far, and though it wasn't my intention, I have no way out now. Her voice unconsciously had a soft, almost sweet tone. Saul had only mentioned it casually, and he wasn't very familiar with Angela. If Angela hadn't immediately suppressed her killing intent after realizing who he was, Saul wouldn't have even said that much. After dealing with Angela, Saul bent down and patted George, but his palm passed right through George's face. He smiled helplessly and suddenly twisted his hand deep into George's brain. A huge mental shock instantly woke George up. His confused eyes met the semi-transparent Saul, and he almost fainted again from fright. "Saul, no, Lord Saul." He cautiously and respectfully looked at Saul, whose body was half transparent, wondering if Saul had died, but he didn't dare ask. After confirming that George had woken up and seemed physically fine, Saul stood up and said to Angela, "I've taken the person." Angela lowered her head, silent, looking reluctant but also not daring to stop him. Seeing this, Saul didn't waste any more words and directly motioned for George to stand and follow him. Although George was terrified of Saul's current form, he feared Angela even more. Moreover, Saul had seemed to save him just now. He weakly stood up and saw his brother's corpse on the floor again. He bit his lip and shed another tear, but he gritted his teeth and said nothing. George knew how lucky he was to be alive. Though deeply sorrowful over his brother's death, he had no way of changing anything. After all, he was just a weak servant. In front of a wizard, what authority did an ordinary person have? If Saul hadn't shown up in time, he would probably have ended up like his brother, a bloody flower made of flesh and bone. When they reached the laboratory door, Saul stepped aside. He pointed to the lab door. "You open it." George didn't ask questions and obediently did as told. Just as George was opening the door, Angela, who was watching them from behind, suddenly changed her expression. But just as she was about to raise her right hand, her left hand grabbed her right wrist. Angela's movements froze in place, and she could only watch as Saul and George left the laboratory. When Saul stepped out the door, he glanced at Angela, his eyes scanning her tightly clenched hands, before showing a mysterious smile. After Saul's figure disappeared, Angela immediately went forward and closed the laboratory door. "Why did you stop me just now? I wasn't trying to act, just testing things out. Didn't you see his condition? Even though I don't know how he appeared in the East Tower in this soul state, didn't you say souls wandering in the East Tower would be seeking death?" Before Angela could finish, her puzzled expression suddenly turned dark. "You don't understand." Her voice trembled slightly. "You can't see it, but his body is full of my kind." "What?" Without replying to the surprised exclamation behind her, Saul led George toward the passage between the East and West Towers. He watched George stop at the boundary of the West Tower and not follow him. "George!" "Lord Saul." George lowered his head as usual, but his eyes were extremely bloodshot. George was still grieving the loss of his brother, but he didn't realize that something far worse awaited him, that he hadn't fully lost his brother yet. He would come to realize this horrifying truth sooner or later. "George," Saul looked at him calmly, "I remember 2 years ago you wanted to become my exclusive servant." "My lord, I was wrong. I will never think like that again." George's face was grim, and today's events had clearly given him a huge blow. "You won't be able to be my exclusive servant. Now, you have 2 options." Saul waited for George to look up in confusion before continuing. "You can become a wizard apprentice, or you can return to being a servant." George's eyes widened in disbelief, the blood vessels in his eyes clearly visible. He reflexively asked, "Can I really become a wizard apprentice?" "You probably couldn't in the past. Although you have some talent, your mental strength was too weak. But now, if you want to, you can try." Hearing this, George didn't hesitate. "I want to, my lord. I want to become a wizard apprentice." He and Saul were once of equal standing, and Saul had been isolated by others. But Saul became a wizard apprentice, and from that moment on, they were worlds apart. Especially after these past few days, George had come to understand what the nobility and power of a wizard really meant. Facing that terrifying woman earlier, George had no ability to resist, but just Saul's appearance made her retreat and spare him. Of course, George had also briefly thought, if Saul had arrived a few minutes earlier, would David still be alive? But he quickly discarded that thought, afraid someone would notice. Those of low status have neither the courage nor the right to vent their anger. From George's trembling words, Saul could feel his urgency. There's no need to decide so quickly. Becoming a wizard means not just gaining power and status, but also countless dangers and the unknown. George was confused. Aren't there dangers and unknown things brought to ordinary people by wizards? What if you might not live past 30? What if you might turn into something like me? Saul's semi-transparent body softened, his limbs fused together, and new tentacles grew, revealing sinister mouths under their suckers. The tentacles reached George's face, and from one of the suckers a long tongue emerged, gently licking George's skin. Though he felt nothing, George broke out in goosebumps but dared not move, as though frozen in place. Saul withdrew his tentacles and resumed his human form. Go back and think about it. If you still want to become a wizard apprentice, the next time there's a new group of students coming into the tower, you can find the steward. George was relieved, as he didn't have to decide right away. After respectfully bowing to Saul, George's figure disappeared beyond the West Tower passage. The candles around him suddenly brightened, meaning it was almost 6 in the morning. After 6, the safety of the East and West Towers would increase. Strange. It's already this late. Why hasn't the diary warned me about my soul leaving for too long and being wasted? Saul looked at his left shoulder. When his body had been torn apart in the pipes earlier, the diary hadn't appeared. Was it because the diary had concluded that, with Saul's current strength, he could escape on his own? Or, Saul rubbed his stomach, still feeling an inexplicable hunger, watching the candles longingly. Could it be because I ate so many strange things earlier? The energy within them might have prolonged my time outside my body. For a moment, Saul didn't know whether his soul leaving his body this night was a good thing or a bad one. Finally found you. Suddenly, a voice came from behind Saul. He quickly turned around to see a man in a cloak walking toward him from the corridor on the opposite side. The man stopped 5 meters away from Saul, gently lifting his hood to reveal a face with heterochromatic eyes. At that moment, his purple eyes were faintly glowing. Haywood, Saul squinted. Seeing a third-tier apprentice in his soul form was hardly a good sign. I've been looking for you for a long time. You sure can run from the 2nd floor of the East Tower to here so quickly. East Tower, 2nd floor, Saul's face darkened. Is tonight's incident related to you? Chapter 220, Haywood and Heidi. Haywood's expression shifted slightly. Let's talk about this back in the storeroom. Saul was indeed eager to return. Tonight's painful experience made him long for the safety of having his soul firmly inside his body. Just as the Tower Master had said, it was not a good thing for him to have his soul out of the body. But would following Haywood back lead to another unexpected danger? The diary didn't appear. Hey diary bro, you didn't break, did you? Saul asked mentally. The diary flipped a page, facing its cover toward him. Good, not broken. That means Haywood doesn't plan on doing anything to me, for now. The candlelight illuminated the road ahead, and Saul felt more confident. If Haywood really tries anything, maybe I can escape through the candle duct. Perhaps sensing Saul's burning gaze, the steadily flickering flame suddenly trembled. That flicker caught Haywood's attention. How much did you see just now? Saul suddenly asked, diverting Haywood's focus. Haywood smiled. Since you left Mentor Kaz's lab. He knew there was no point lying to Saul, so he simply spoke the truth. That servant named George, his soul has already mutated. If you weren't protecting him, I believe by tomorrow he'd end up on some apprentice's lab table. Saul frowned. He knew he could protect George for now, but not forever. And honestly, he had no intention of doing so forever. He had helped this time because George had once helped him, and seeing George had brought back memories. Those old memories had conveniently helped Saul stabilize his consciousness. So he gave George a chance to become a wizard apprentice. In fact, that was the only way George could survive for the time being. If he gave up the path to becoming an apprentice, his fragile human mental resistance would break down within a year due to the extra head in his mind. He'd go insane. Watching Saul deep in thought, Haywood added, "Of course, since you've asked, I'll arrange it. Let him consider at his own pace, until he either becomes an apprentice or dies." He stepped in closer. For people like us, bringing a lowly servant into the wizarding world is nothing more than a word. Saul's face broke into a bright grin. "Then I must thank you. You're really kind, Senior." Haywood froze. For some reason, Saul's beaming smile gave him more unease than his earlier gloomy expression. Under Haywood's escort, Saul returned to the first floor of the East Tower. Standing before the bronze gate, Haywood stepped forward to push it open without needing Saul to explain. The terrifyingly thin arms were no longer visible outside the gate, but Saul still kept on high alert as he passed through the door Haywood had opened. Fortunately, everything went smoothly. He returned to the second storeroom and re-entered his body. However, when passing through the corpse-filled room, his soul kept getting stuck to corpse. It took considerable force to peel himself free each time. Luckily, his body still lay motionless on the single bed, unchanged. That eased Saul's lingering worries. When he opened the door and stepped out of the second storeroom, he found Haywood still waiting outside. "Now then, Senior," Saul said with a steadier tone, now back in his body, "can you tell me how you found out that my soul was out of my body? After all, I have to report the bizarre experience last night." Haywood let out a long sigh. "This does have something to do with me." He suddenly pulled down his hood and turned his head, showing Saul the back of it. Where a grotesque witch's face had once been, there was now only bald, scar-riddled skin. "I haven't had a chance to introduce her." Haywood turned back and casually put his hood back on. "That woman's name was Heidi. She was a curse I crafted from my twin sister." Saul blinked. "Twin sister?" "My parents were both third-rank wizard apprentices," Haywood explained. "They made several modifications to their bodies that had major effects but weren't suitable for them. After reaching third rank, they had no chance of becoming true wizards." He then offered Saul a word of advice. "Before you become a true wizard, I wouldn't recommend modifying any vital organs." Hearing that, Saul suddenly thought of Kongsha. The organs that the senior sister transformed are no longer called important organs. They are fatal organs. Haywood continued, "They tried every method to have children, but when my sister and I were born, something went wrong. Our mother mutated during childbirth. My father had no choice but to kill her in order to save us. Even so, my sister was affected. Her head was normal, but the rest of her body was the size of a pinky finger." Haywood remained calm even as he spoke of his mother's death and his sister's deformity. "My sister was kept in a jar, and I carried her everywhere, studying, living, playing, until I was 6, and my father decided to turn us into a twin curse to extend his life." Saul kept a blank expression. He wasn't the least surprised by how this turned out. Wizards simply weren't normal people. In fact, he suspected Haywood and his sister had been born solely for the sake of prolonging their parents' lives. There had probably never been any fruit of love to begin with. What did pique Saul's curiosity was, how did a 6-year-old Haywood survive an assassination attempt by a third-rank wizard apprentice? Haywood seemed to read his look and smiled slightly as he continued. "Fortunately, my father had never stopped me and my sister from going out, so quite a few people knew about us. That year, the Tower Master personally came and wanted to take me in. My father disagreed at first, but later, he gave his silent approval." Saul sneered, probably the kind of approval that comes from being dead. At this point, Haywood's expression shifted subtly, tinged with guilt and sorrow. Unfortunately, I disappointed the Tower Master. He abruptly cut off the unpleasant topic and replaced his expression with a smile. After entering the Wizard Tower, I transferred my sister from the jar to the skin on the back of my head. I had cared for her for years, so she was a bit spoiled. Haywood finally circled back to last night. But I didn't expect her to foolishly believe that if you died, the silver eye would become hers. So my soul ended up out of my body and accidentally entered the lower floor because of her, Saul asked in a low voice. The second storeroom wasn't a place just anyone could enter. It housed important materials for the Wizard Tower L. There are 22 floors in the Gorsa Wizard Tower, including the basement, but that's the structure for ordinary people or ordinary apprentices. In reality, the tower also has interlayers. Interlayers. Saul immediately recalled those countless staring eyes, the noodle-like thin arms, and the mouths that could only scream about being hungry. Those monsters must live in the interlayers. There's an interlayer between the first and second storerooms. The corridor we're standing in now is the only passage through. He paused for a moment. She knew your soul was unstable, so she risked crossing the interlayer to get to you. I think she wanted to drag your soul into the interlayer. Then you die without anyone knowing why. But the outcome is that you ran out from the basement tunnel and Heidi didn't come back. Saul, in that case, allow me 3 hearty laughs.